What would you do if the most powerful woman in the city walked into your life and offered you $200,000? Not for love, not for loyalty, but for a lie? Caleb Turner never expected to be sitting across from a billionaire, listening to a proposal that would either save his family or destroy everything he believed in. He was a man drowning in debt, watching his father die, and raising a daughter alone. She was a woman who had everything, except the one thing a judge would believe. So she bought a husband, and neither of them expected what came next. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit like and stay with me until the very end. The alarm went off at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before it was supposed to. Caleb Turner lay flat on his back in the dark of his apartment, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had been slowly expanding since October. He didn't move to silence the phone. He just let it scream until it stopped on its own, and then the silence that followed was somehow louder than the alarm had been. He was 32 years old, and most mornings lately, the first thing he felt when he woke up was the specific, bone-deep exhaustion of a man who had been treading water for so long that he'd forgotten what the shore looked like. He lay there for 3 more minutes. He counted because his brain wouldn't turn off. And then he heard the small sound that always got him moving when nothing else could. A shuffle, a tiny cough, then bare feet padding down the hall.
Daddy?
Mia appeared in the doorway wearing her pink pajamas with the dinosaurs on them, the left sleeve half rolled up the way she always slept, one hand clutching the worn rabbit she'd had since she was 18 months old. She was 6 years old and the most serious, watchful child Caleb had ever known. She didn't rush into the room the way other kids might. She just stood there watching him, as though she was making sure he was still breathing. He smiled at her. It was the easiest thing he did all day. "Hey, Bug, you're up early." "So are you," she said, with the logic of a child who noticed everything. "Come here." She crossed the room in 4 steps and climbed up beside him, tucking herself under his arm with practiced efficiency. She smelled like sleep and strawberry shampoo. Caleb held her and stared at the ceiling and felt the particular kind of grief that lives in the space between loving someone completely and knowing you aren't giving them enough. Mia's mother, Jess, had left when Mia was 2. Not violently, not dramatically, just gone, the way a tide goes out, slowly and then all at once. A note on the kitchen counter. A packed bag. A phone number that rang twice and then stopped working. Caleb had stood in the kitchen of that old apartment holding the note in one hand and Mia in the other arm, and something in him had quietly, permanently reorganized itself around the fact that it was now just the 2 of them. He didn't hate Jess. He'd stopped even being angry at her. But sometimes, in the early mornings when the apartment was quiet and the weight of everything pressing down felt especially heavy, he let himself feel the exhaustion of doing this alone. He pushed it down. He always did. "Okay, Bug," he said, kissing the top of Mia's head. "Let's go make pancakes." The letter from the hospital had arrived on a Tuesday. Caleb had known it was coming. He'd been dreading it, the way you dread something you have no power to stop. Not with panic, but with a dull, nauseating certainty. He'd stood at the kitchen counter, Mia eating cereal behind him at the table, and opened the envelope with the same mechanical calm he applied to most things that scared him. The number inside made him put the letter down and brace both hands on the counter. $47,000. His father, Gerald Turner, had been diagnosed with stage 3 kidney disease 8 months earlier. The kind of diagnosis that arrives quietly and then takes over your entire life. Gerald was 61 years old and had worked as a plumber his whole life. Union, reliable, proud. And his insurance covered the basics. But the basics, Caleb had learned, were never enough. The dialysis treatments alone were running over $3,000 a month, and Gerald's kidneys were losing ground faster than the doctors had predicted. Caleb visited his father twice a week at the care facility on the east side of the city. He drove 40 minutes each way, usually arriving after Mia was in bed, sitting beside his father's chair while the dialysis machine hummed and Gerald tried to pretend he wasn't dying. "You look tired," Gerald told him every single visit. "I'm fine, Dad." "Caleb." Gerald would look at him with those steady, dark eyes that saw through everything. "I know what fine looks like on you. That's not it." Caleb would change the subject. He'd talk about Mia, about something funny she'd said, about a drawing she'd made at school. Gerald would light up at anything about Mia. She was the thing that still made his face look like it used to, warm and open, and not carrying the shadow of a man who knew his time was shortening. What Caleb never told his father was the number. The $47,000, growing every month. His savings, which had never been much, the modest accumulation of a man who was careful with money out of necessity, were almost gone. He'd already taken out a small personal loan. He'd sold his car and bought a used one half its value. He'd cut subscriptions, dropped his gym membership, eaten sandwiches at his desk every day for 6 months. And still the number climbed. He worked at Hale Technologies as a senior operations analyst. It was a good job, stable and well-paying by most standards, though not by the standards of the world he existed in now, where the cost of keeping his father alive and raising a child in the city required a mathematical precision that left almost no margin for error. His supervisor had given him a solid review. He was reliable, precise, and good at solving problems other people found frustrating. He had been with the company for 4 years. He kept his head down. He met his deadlines. He was the kind of employee that organizations depended on and rarely thought about. He had no idea that the woman who ran the entire company had thought about him at all. Hale Technologies occupied the top 12 floors of a glass tower in the financial district, and Caleb had been inside the executive suite on the 8th floor exactly twice in 4 years. Once for an emergency IT briefing during a data breach, and once by accident when he'd taken the wrong elevator. The day his life changed, he received an email at 2:17 p.m. Mr. Turner, Ms. Hale would like to meet with you in the executive suite at 3 p.m. today. This is a personal matter. Please come alone. Mr. Chen, executive assistant. He read it 3 times. Then he looked around at his colleagues as though one of them might be able to explain it. Nobody was looking at him. He glanced back at the screen. A personal matter. His first thought was that he was being fired. His second thought was that you don't get fired by the CEO. You get fired by HR. His third thought was that Victoria Hale had never, in 4 years, spoken directly to him. He was not in her world. He was 3 organizational layers below her world. He took the elevator to the 8th floor at 2:58 p.m., straightened his tie in the reflective surface of the elevator doors, and told himself to stay calm. The executive suite was everything the rest of the building was not. Quieter. Warmer. The kind of space that communicated authority without trying too hard. Dark walnut desks, low lighting, soft furniture in charcoal and ivory. Ms. Chen, a precise woman in her 40s who conveyed competence the way other people conveyed warmth, greeted him without smiling and led him to a set of double doors. She's expecting you, Ms. Chen said, and stepped back. Caleb knocked twice and pushed the door open. Victoria Hale was standing at the window with her back to him, looking out at the city. She was 30 years old and one of the most recognizable faces in the tech industry, not because she sought attention, but because she had built something that demanded it. Hale Technologies was worth $4.2 billion. She had founded it at 23 with a small team and a product idea that the industry had initially dismissed. 3 years later, the same people who dismissed her were trying to acquire her company. She was wearing a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, her dark hair pulled back simply. She didn't look like the version of herself that appeared in Forbes profiles and keynote conferences. She looked, Caleb thought, like a woman who was very tired and working hard not to show it. She turned when she heard him close the door. Mr. Turner, thank you for coming. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. Please sit. He sat. She remained standing, which felt intentional. The posture of someone who needed the small tactical advantage of height. He watched her carefully and said nothing, waiting. Victoria looked at him for a moment. Then she did something he hadn't expected. She sat down across from him, not behind her desk, but in the chair beside it, closer than the desk would have placed them. More human. I'm going to speak plainly, she said, because I don't have time to be anything else, and I think you'd prefer it that way. He nodded once. I would. I've been watching your work for the past 18 months. You're effective, discreet, and you don't involve yourself in office politics. She paused. Those qualities matter to me right now in ways that go beyond your professional performance. Caleb kept his expression neutral, though something in his chest had shifted slightly. Not alarm, but attention. The careful, quiet attention of a man who knew that important things were being said. I'm in a legal situation, Victoria said. My ex-husband, Daniel Mercer, has filed for full custody of our daughter, Sophie. She's 5. Something moved briefly across her face, not weakness, but the precise, controlled flash of someone who felt something deeply and had learned to contain it. His argument is that my professional life makes me an unsuitable primary parent, that I travel too much, work too many hours, and that Sophie would have greater stability with him. I'm sorry, Caleb said. My attorney has advised me, Victoria continued, as though she hadn't heard him, or as though she had heard him and couldn't afford to let it matter right now, that my case would be substantially strengthened if I were in a stable, committed relationship. More specifically, if I were married. The word landed in the room like something solid. Caleb was very still. Victoria held his gaze. I need a husband, Mr. Turner, for 1 year. A legal marriage conducted through an official ceremony, with both of us maintaining a convincing shared life during the custody proceedings. She leaned forward very slightly. I'm prepared to pay you $200,000 for that year. The payment would be structured in installments, a portion up front, the remainder upon completion of the arrangement. The silence stretched between them for 5 full seconds. Then Caleb said very quietly, "You're serious." "I'm always serious." She tilted her head slightly. "I want to be clear about what I'm asking. I'm not asking for anything personal. I'm asking for a legal arrangement, a believable domestic life that holds up under scrutiny in a courtroom. We would live together, appear together in public, manage the household jointly for the sake of appearances. You have a daughter, I have a daughter. A blended family situation might actually be more convincing than most alternatives." She paused. "I researched you, Mr. Turner. I know your father is ill. I know what the medical costs are doing to your finances. I'm not raising that to be cruel. I'm raising it because I want you to understand that I'm offering you something real." Caleb felt the words settle into him. $200,000, his father's treatments, Mia's future, the loan that was quietly consuming his sleep. He looked at Victoria Hale, this woman who was watching him with eyes that gave nothing away but attention, and he understood that she had done her homework, that this offer had not been made lightly, and that she was, underneath the precision and the tactical composure, a mother who was terrified of losing her child. He recognized that terror. He lived inside a version of it himself. "I need time to think," he said. "Of course." Victoria rose smoothly, signaling the meeting was over. "Take tonight. I need an answer by tomorrow morning." He stood, extended his hand. She shook it. Her grip was firm and brief. At the door, he paused and looked back at her. "The $200,000, he said. "Is that the full amount, or are there additional terms?" Something shifted in her expression. Not quite surprise, but something adjacent to respect. "There's a full contract," she said. "You'll have the opportunity to review it with your own attorney before signing. Everything will be in writing." He nodded once. "Tomorrow morning, then." He walked out of the executive suite and rode the elevator back down to his floor. He sat at his desk and stared at his monitor for the remaining 40 minutes of the workday without reading a single thing on the screen. That evening, Caleb picked Mia up from after-school care at 5:45, stopping at the grocery store where she rode in the cart, and told him with great seriousness about a disagreement she'd had with her friend Becca over whose drawing of a horse was more accurate. "Mine had 4 legs," Mia said. "How many did Becca's have?" "Also 4, but her hooves were wrong." "Devastating," Caleb agreed. Mia regarded him solemnly. "You're being silly." "I'm being serious. Hoof accuracy is extremely important." This made her laugh, and he held the sound of it in his chest for the rest of the evening like something he needed to keep warm. He made pasta for dinner, helped her with reading homework, gave her a bath, and read 2 chapters of a book about a girl who discovered she could talk to foxes. By 8:30, Mia was asleep with the rabbit tucked under her chin, and Caleb was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the weight of the most consequential decision he'd ever faced. He made a list. He was a man who made lists because emotion alone had never been a reliable compass. Reasons to say yes. $200,000. His father's treatments, fully covered, potentially for the rest of his care. Relief from debt that was currently suffocating him. Stability for Mia. A better apartment. A better future. It was a legal arrangement. No deception beyond the nature of the marriage itself. Reasons to say no. He would be lying. To a court, to to colleagues, to everyone. He barely knew this woman. What if it became complicated? What example was he setting for Mia? He looked at the second list for a long time. Then he thought about his father, sitting in that chair with the dialysis machine humming, trying to look strong for a son who was trying to look strong for him. He thought about Gerald's hands, rough and calloused from 40 years of physical work, resting on the chair's arms like something that had been put down and wasn't sure if it would be picked up again. He thought about Mia asking him last month, with the calm, factual directness that was entirely her personality, "Daddy, are we going to be okay?" He had told her yes without hesitation. He had wanted it to be true. Caleb closed the list. He put down his pen. He sat in the quiet kitchen of his small apartment and let himself feel the full weight of everything. The love, the fear, the pride, the exhaustion, the desperation disguised as calm. He let himself be, for a few minutes, just a man who was trying very hard and falling short in ways that kept him up at night. Then he went to bed. He didn't sleep. At 4:14 a.m., lying on his back in the dark, he made his decision. He thought about what it meant to be a man who provided for the people who needed him. His father had been that man, had come home every night smelling like work, had put food on the table, and never complained where Caleb could hear him, had shown up, again and again, in all the ways that mattered. Caleb had watched his father be slowly defeated by a body that was giving out. He had watched a man who had worked for everything. He had slowly become dependent on machines and medicine and bills that didn't care how hard anyone had worked. He could fix that. He had been handed, by the most unlikely possible person, the means to fix that. He got up at 5 a.m., made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table watching the sky outside the window change from black to gray to the pale, tentative gold of early morning. He thought about dignity, his father's, his own, his daughter's. He thought about the difference between a deal that was dishonest and a decision that was hard. When Mia woke up at 6:30, he was still sitting at the table. "You didn't sleep," she said, appearing in the doorway with that watchful look. "I slept a little," he said. "Come have breakfast." She climbed into her chair and watched him make eggs with the focused attention she gave to most things. "Are you okay, Daddy?" He looked at her serious brown eyes and her messy morning hair and the rabbit she'd set on the table beside her plate. "Yeah, Bug," he said, "I think I'm about to be." He was at the executive suite at 8:02 a.m. Ms. Chen looked mildly surprised to see him, which Caleb suspected was not an expression that woman wore often. She made a brief phone call and then nodded him through. Victoria was already at her desk. She looked like she'd been there for a while, or possibly like she hadn't left. She was holding a cup of coffee and looking at something on her monitor, and when Caleb entered, she set the cup down and gave him her full attention with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned that divided attention was a form of disrespect. "You've made a decision," she said. Not a question. "I have." He sat down in the same chair as before. "I have conditions." One of her eyebrows shifted very slightly. "Tell me." "The contract needs to specifically protect my daughter. I won't have her in a situation that causes her emotional harm. If at any point Mia is struggling with the arrangement, with the move, with the change in her life, I need the ability to revisit the terms." "Agreed." "My father's medical bills. I'll need the first installment within 10 days of signing, not 30. 10. Victoria nodded. "I can arrange that. And if the arrangement ends for any reason before the year is up, if you decide to terminate it, or if circumstances change, I still receive 50% of the agreed amount." She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, considering. Then, 60%, and I'll agree. He looked at her. "Why more?" "Because I'm asking you to uproot your life and bring your child into my home on the basis of a legal document and my word. The additional percentage is acknowledgement of that." She held his gaze. "I'm not trying to take advantage of you, Mr. Turner. This arrangement only works if we both feel it's fair." He sat with that for a moment. "One more thing," he said. "Go ahead. I'll maintain a separate bedroom, at least initially." He said it without apology or embarrassment. "We can determine together what the arrangement looks like in terms of shared spaces as things develop. But I'm not walking into your house and pretending from day one that we're something we're not when it's just the two of us. When we're in public, when we're in situations that require it, I'll do what's necessary, but in private, we're two people with an agreement, not a performance. Victoria was quiet for a moment that felt different from her other silences. This one was not calculating. It was, Caleb thought, something more like relief. That's the most reasonable thing anyone has said to me in months, she said. He almost smiled. Almost. I'll have my attorney look at the contract, he said. I'll have comments back to you by Friday. Fine. She rose and extended her hand. We have a deal, Mr. Turner. He stood and shook her hand, same firm, brief grip as the day before. Caleb, he said. She blinked. If we're going to be married, he said, you should probably use my first name. There was a pause. And then, for the first time since he'd entered that office, something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood appeared on her face. Victoria, she said. They were married on a Thursday morning at 9:15 a.m. at the city courthouse, with Ms. Chen and Caleb's closest friend, Marcus Webb, serving as witnesses. It was not a romantic occasion. It was, in fact, spectacularly practical. The clerk's office smelled like old paper and the particular bureaucratic indifference of a room that has seen 10,000 important moments and treated each one with equal efficiency. Caleb wore a charcoal suit he'd owned for 3 years. Victoria wore a cream blazer over dark slacks. There were no flowers, no music, no other guests. Marcus stood beside Caleb with the expression of a man who had many, many questions and had agreed to hold all of them until later. The justice of the peace was a compact man in his 60s who delivered the ceremony with the brisk warmth of someone who had performed a great many of these and genuinely did not see a reason to linger. He asked the required questions. They gave the required answers. They exchanged rings, simple bands, purchased together 3 days earlier from a jewelry store, where the saleswoman had correctly read the atmosphere and made no attempt at sentiment. When the justice said, "You may kiss the bride," there was a pause that lasted approximately half a second too long. Caleb looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at Caleb. He leaned forward and pressed his lips briefly to her cheek. The social kiss, the kind exchanged at professional functions. It was completely appropriate and entirely absurd, and both of them knew it. Marcus cleared his throat. "Congratulations," the justice said, with the tone of a man who had given this speech 6 times before noon and would give it 4 more times before 5. The papers were signed. The date was recorded. The document was sealed. Caleb Turner and Victoria Hale were legally, officially married. They walked out of the courthouse into the cold November sunlight, and Marcus fell into step beside Caleb, and after exactly 4 steps he said very quietly, "You are going to tell me literally everything, right?" "At dinner," Caleb said. "Is this an elaborate prank?" "It's not." "Because it feels like Marcus?" "Yeah." "At dinner." Marcus pressed his lips together and nodded once, with the air of a man exercising a truly remarkable amount of restraint. Behind them, Victoria walked with Ms. Chen, speaking in a low, efficient voice about the afternoon schedule. She had a board meeting at 2, a call with her attorney at 4, a press appearance Friday that would now need to incorporate, carefully and naturally, the fact of her new marriage. She had the look of a woman executing a plan, focused, controlled, forward-moving. But at the bottom of the courthouse steps, she paused, and without any particular reason, she glanced back over her shoulder at Caleb, who was talking quietly with Marcus. He was looking at the city, at the gray November sky, and there was something on his face that she hadn't expected. Not doubt, not regret, just the particular quiet steadiness of a man who had made his decision and was standing inside it. She looked away, and felt unexpectedly that she had made a better choice than she'd realized. Victoria's home was not what Caleb had imagined, though he'd tried not to imagine it too specifically. It was large, 7 bedrooms, a library, a kitchen that was larger than his entire former apartment, but it was not cold. He'd expected something that felt like a hotel or a magazine feature, all hard edges and expensive emptiness. Instead, it was a house that had been genuinely lived in, with Sophie's drawings on the refrigerator and a basket of mismatched shoes by the front door, and books left face down on the coffee table. It was a home. That surprised him. He arrived on a Saturday, with Mia and 2 SUV loads of their belongings. His former apartment had been a 900 square foot two-bedroom in a building where the elevator broke twice a year and the neighbors had a dog that barked every time the wind changed. This was something else entirely. Sophie met them at the front door. She was 5 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and a deliberate, evaluating quality to her gaze that was also her mother's. She looked at Mia with the careful assessment of a child who had not had many children in her house. Mia looked back with equal seriousness. There was a silence that lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then Mia held out the rabbit. "This is Henry," she said. "He's shy at first, but he's very nice once he knows you." Sophie considered the rabbit carefully. "Does he bite?" "No, he doesn't have real teeth. He looks soft. He's very soft. You can touch him if you want." Sophie reached out and touched the rabbit's ear, very gently, with one finger. Then she looked up at Mia with something that was not quite a smile, but was unmistakably an opening. "I have a cat," Sophie said. "Her name is Duchess. She bites sometimes, but only when she's in a mood." "I like cats," Mia said. "Okay," Sophie said. And then, with the decisive authority of a child who had made up her mind, "Come see my room." They disappeared up the stairs together. Caleb stood in the entrance hall with a box in his arms and watched them go. Then he looked at Victoria, who was standing at the base of the staircase watching the same thing with an expression that she probably didn't realize was showing on her face. Something open, something soft, something she'd clearly been holding in reserve for a very long time. "Well," he said quietly. She turned and looked at him. The expression closed slightly, resettling into its professional composure. But not all the way. "The room at the end of the hall," she said, meaning his room. "Mrs. Park can help you with the rest of your boxes." "I've got it," he said. She nodded and moved toward her office. Then she stopped without turning around. "Thank you," she said, "for bringing her." Caleb looked at the empty staircase where the two little girls had just been. "She would have been furious if I hadn't," he said. He thought he might have heard something that could have been a quiet laugh. He carried his box upstairs, found his room, large and well-appointed and genuinely comfortable, with its own bathroom and a view of the back garden, and stood at the window for a moment looking out at the yard with its winter bare trees. He thought about the water stain on the ceiling of his old apartment. He thought about his father in that chair. He thought, "You made the right call." He didn't entirely believe it yet, but he was starting to. That evening, after the girls had eaten dinner together and been put to bed, a process that revealed, among other things, that Sophie was deeply opinionated about bedtime stories, and Mia was an unexpectedly skilled negotiator when it came to the definition of lights out. Caleb and Victoria sat at the kitchen island with the remains of the dinner Mrs. Park had left for them. They sat across from each other, two people who were legally married and almost entirely strangers, in the kitchen of the house they now shared, eating reheated pasta. It was spectacularly awkward. Victoria broke the silence first. "We should establish ground rules." "Agreed." Caleb poured himself more water. "You first." She set down her fork. "In this house, in private, we are what we are. Two people with a legal agreement sharing a living space for practical reasons. No performance necessary when it's just us. I don't need you to pretend to be in love with me in the kitchen at 7 in the morning. Noted. My turn? Go ahead. I help with the house. That's not negotiable. I don't do well being in a space without contributing to it. If something needs doing, cooking, repairs, school pickups, whatever, I'm available. Don't treat me like a guest." Something moved in her expression. "Fair, that's actually—" She stopped. "What?" "Nothing. It's fair. Go on." "The children don't get used as props," he said, and his voice changed slightly. Not louder, but more grounded. The particular tone of someone stating a principle they will not debate. "Whatever happens between us, however this arrangement plays out, Mia and Sophie don't perform for anyone. They're kids. They'll find their own way through this." Victoria held his gaze. "We're in complete agreement there." "Okay." He picked up his fork. "What about public appearances?" "We'll be expected to attend a few events together. My attorney says the more visible we are as a couple, the stronger the case. I'll give you advance notice. I don't like surprises, and I assume you don't either." "I don't." "You'll need a cover story for people who know you. Your friend, Marcus, Marcus knows the basics. He signed a non-disclosure. Caleb paused. He wasn't happy about the NDA. Most people aren't. He signed it anyway because he's a good man who trusts me. He looked at her. He's going to have a lot of opinions. They usually do. She looked back at him steadily. Anyone else I should know about? My father. Caleb's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. A barely perceptible tightening. He's at Riverside Care on the east side. I visit him twice a week. He'll need to know something, even if it's a simplified version. He's ill, not unaware. Victoria was quiet for a moment. What will you tell him? I'll tell him I met someone, Caleb said, and that it moved fast. That part, at least, is technically true. She nodded slowly, then, I'm sorry about his illness. Yeah. He looked at his plate. Me too. The silence that followed was different from the earlier one, less awkward, more like the kind of quiet that exists between two people who have both said something true. This is strange, Victoria said finally. Caleb looked up. That's probably the most honest thing either of us has said tonight. She almost smiled. Get some rest. Tomorrow is a school day and Sophie has a standing meltdown about her hair on Mondays. He raised an eyebrow. Standing meltdown? Every Monday. It's been happening since October. I have not yet found a solution. I have a 6-year-old who considers the correct placement of her hair accessories to be a matter of genuine moral urgency, Caleb said. Between us, we might be able to triangulate something. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite read. Good night, Caleb, she said. Good night, Victoria. She carried her plate to the sink, rinsed it, set it in the rack with the precise efficiency she brought to everything, and disappeared down the hall. Caleb sat alone in the enormous, quiet kitchen of his new wife's house, finished the last of his pasta, and thought that whatever this year was going to be, it was going to be unlike anything he had ever lived before. He was right about that. The Monday morning hair crisis arrived exactly as Victoria had predicted. Caleb heard it before he saw it. A high, sustained note of protest coming from the second floor at 7:14 a.m., sharp enough to cut through the sound of the coffee maker and Mrs. Park's quiet movements in the pantry. He stood at the kitchen counter with his mug and listened for a moment, calibrating. It wasn't distress. It wasn't fear. It was the very specific vocal frequency of a child who had encountered a situation she considered fundamentally unjust. He set down his mug, climbed the stairs, and followed the sound to Sophie's room. Victoria was standing behind her daughter at the vanity mirror, hairbrush in hand, with the expression of a woman who had been through this particular battle enough times to know she was losing before it started. Sophie sat on the small upholstered stool with her arms crossed, and her chin set at an angle that was, Caleb noted, completely identical to her mother's. I don't want a braid, Sophie said, for what was clearly not the first time this morning. A braid is tidy, and it stays in place, Victoria said, with the careful, measured tone of someone maintaining composure through effort alone. I want it down. Your hair gets in your eyes when it's down. I don't care. Your teacher cares. Miss Freeman has never said anything about my hair. Sophie? Caleb knocked twice on the open door. Both of them looked at him. Sophie's expression shifted to the evaluating watchfulness she'd shown on the day they arrived. Not hostile, but measuring. Victoria's expression shifted to something that was equal parts relief and professional reluctance to show it. What if, Caleb said, stepping into the room and crouching down to Sophie's eye level, we did something in the middle? Sophie looked at him. What's the middle? Half up, half down. Tidy enough for school, but your hair's still mostly down. Some people call it a half pony. He picked up the comb from the vanity. Can I? Sophie considered this with enormous seriousness. Then she uncrossed her arms by about 50%, which Caleb correctly interpreted as provisional consent. He combed Sophie's dark hair gently, working out the tangles with a patience that came from 6 years of practice, and gathered the top half into a small, neat tie. It took 4 minutes. Sophie watched herself in the mirror with critical attention. It's okay, she said finally. This, from Sophie, was high praise. Victoria caught Caleb's eye in the mirror. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Downstairs, Mia was eating cereal and reading a book simultaneously, which was a skill she had apparently possessed since birth. She glanced up when Sophie appeared. Your hair looks nice, Mia said. Sophie sat down with the satisfied dignity of someone whose position had been vindicated. Thank you. Victoria poured herself a coffee and stood at the counter and watched the two girls eat breakfast together in the morning light of a kitchen that, for the first time in a long time, had more than two people in it. The house sounded different. It sounded, she thought, like it was occupied in a way it hadn't been before, like rooms that had been holding their breath had quietly let it out. She was not accustomed to noticing things like that. She was not accustomed to having the stillness to notice them. Caleb appeared beside her and refilled his own mug. They stood side by side without speaking, watching the girls. Thank you, Victoria said, quietly enough that it didn't carry to the table. Mondays are hard, he said. Mia used to cry every Sunday night preemptively because she already knew Monday was coming. Sophie doesn't cry. She just digs in. I noticed. He glanced sideways at her. She gets that from you. Victoria looked at him. He was looking at the girls with the same calm, observational expression he wore most of the time, steady and unhurried, taking things in without broadcasting what he thought of them. She had noticed, in the week since he'd moved in, that Caleb Turner had a quality she rarely encountered. He was genuinely comfortable with silence. He didn't fill it compulsively, didn't perform ease. He simply existed in it. It was unexpectedly disarming. The investigator, she said, switching registers completely, back to the business of the arrangement. Daniel's team has someone watching the house. My attorney flagged it yesterday. Caleb's expression didn't change. How do you know? A car parked across the street for 4 hours on Saturday. Same model, different plates on Sunday. Marcus noticed it when he came to help you unload. She paused. He told me directly, which I appreciated. He's thorough, Caleb said. He's protective of you, she said, which is appropriate. She turned slightly toward him. The point is that we need to be more careful about how things look, even at the house, especially at the house. What does that mean in practical terms? It means that separate bedrooms, while reasonable for us, is a liability if someone is watching. The configuration of this house, the wing where your room is, it reads as separate. My attorney was direct about it. Caleb was quiet for a moment. At the table, Mia had said something to Sophie that made Sophie tip her head to one side with focused curiosity. Neither of them was paying any attention to the adults. The master bedroom, Caleb said. Yes. Another silence. You understand my position, he said. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't a statement either. It was an opening, an invitation for her to demonstrate that she did. I understand completely, Victoria said. And I want to be clear that I'm not asking for anything other than the appearance. The room is large. There's a sitting area with a sofa. We're adults. She looked at him. I'm asking because my daughter's future depends on this case, not because I've forgotten the terms of our arrangement. He looked back at her, long enough that she held his gaze without flinching, because she was not a woman who flinched. I'll move my things tonight, he said. She nodded once. Thank you. He poured the rest of his coffee into a travel mug, kissed Mia on the top of her head, told Sophie to have a good day at school, and went to get his coat. Victoria watched him go and felt the strange, vertiginous sensation of a situation expanding beyond the edges of the neat box she'd built for it. She set her coffee down and went to get her own coat. The house continued to breathe around her. The first time they were required to perform as a couple in public was 11 days after the wedding. It was a charity dinner hosted by the Aldrin Foundation, the kind of event that existed at the precise intersection of genuine philanthropy and social positioning, where the tables cost $15,000 and the conversations were carefully engineered. Victoria attended every year. This year, for obvious reasons, she needed to attend with her husband. Caleb had been briefed by Victoria's attorney, a sharp, rapid-fire woman named Diane Holloway, who spoke in bullet points and had the energy of someone perpetually running 5 minutes late, but refusing to acknowledge it. Diane had outlined the key contacts, the expected questions, the narrative they would maintain, and the specific individuals whose opinions would make their way back to the judge through channels that were technically indirect, but practically very direct. Daniel will likely be there, Diane said, during the briefing in her office 2 days before the event. He attends the same circuit. You should expect him to watch, possibly to approach. If he approaches, keep it brief, keep it civil, and under no circumstances let him bait you into any kind of visible conflict. Understood, Caleb said. Diane looked at him over her glasses with the expression of someone revising a prior assessment. You're calmer about this than most people would be. Oh, most people haven't spent 4 years in operations management, Caleb said. Managing problems without showing strain is a professional requirement. Diane glanced at Victoria with an expression that said, quietly and clearly, "He's better than I expected." Victoria said nothing, but she'd thought it first. The night of the dinner, Caleb came downstairs at 7:15 in a dark navy suit that he'd had for 2 years and had clearly taken care of. Well-fitted, clean lines, no performance. He looked at Victoria in the entrance hall and paused in the way people pause when they're recalibrating something. She was wearing a deep burgundy gown, simple and precise, her dark hair down in a way he hadn't seen before. She looked less like a CEO and more like a woman, and the distinction, Caleb thought, was significant in a way he wasn't going to examine too carefully right now. "You look," he started. "Don't," she said. "I was going to say you look ready." She tilted her head slightly. "Oh, we should go." "Yes." They rode in the car, her car, driven by her regular driver, a quiet man named Leonard, who had worked for her for 3 years and demonstrated no interest in anyone's personal life, with 4 inches of seat between them and the city sliding past the windows in streaks of light. Caleb looked out his window. Victoria looked at her phone, reviewing something with the focused attention she brought to everything. Then she put her phone away and looked straight ahead and said, without turning toward him, "When we walk in, I'll take your arm. Is that all right?" "Of course." "And if someone asks how we met, we were introduced through mutual professional contacts. We took our time, and the relationship developed privately. I don't like sharing personal things publicly, which is well established, so the brevity of the explanation will read as consistent." "What if someone pushes for specifics?" "They won't, not directly. People at these events don't push directly. They circle. You'll feel it as a general warmth and curiosity. Just respond with the same level of warmth and no additional detail." "Got it." Another pause. "Caleb." She said his name with a particular deliberateness, the way she said most things, like each word was chosen rather than defaulted to. "You don't have to be someone else tonight. Just be yourself. That's what I want them to see." He looked at her. The city light moved across her face in shifting patterns. "Why me?" he asked. It was the question he'd been holding since the day she'd called him into her office. Specifically, you could have approached anyone, someone already in your world, someone with more to gain from the association. Why someone 3 floors below you in the org chart? She was quiet for a moment. "Because people in my world have their own agendas," she said. "And because you have a reputation in this company for doing exactly what you say you're going to do. No more, no less." She paused. "In my experience, that's rarer than it should be." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then Leonard pulled up to the venue, and the door opened, and the world outside was waiting. Victoria stepped out first. Caleb followed. And when she took his arm at the bottom of the steps, her hand light and precise in the crook of his elbow, her posture perfect, her expression composed into the particular version of herself she wore in public. He matched her pace exactly, and the two of them walked into the room together like they had done it 100 times before. He felt, with a clarity that surprised him, entirely himself. Daniel Mercer was taller than Caleb had expected. He appeared at their table between the first and second courses, materializing with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to entering rooms and finding them already arranged in his favor. He was 40 years old, handsome in a way that came mostly from money and maintenance, and he had the quality, Caleb recognized it immediately from years of watching executives perform, of someone who was always at every moment calculating the impression he was making. He looked at Victoria first, then his eyes moved to Caleb, and something shifted in them. Not surprised, he'd clearly known what to expect, but something that took a measurement. "Victoria," Daniel said. "You look well." "Daniel." Her voice was perfectly level, perfectly warm, perfectly empty of anything real. "You know everyone at the table, I think." He worked the table with practiced ease, a comment here, a handshake there. and then settled his attention back on Caleb with the particular focus of a man who had wanted to do exactly this since he arrived. "Daniel Mercer," he said, extending his hand. Caleb shook it. The grip was firm in the self-conscious way of men who want you to notice their grip. "Caleb Turner. I've heard a great deal about you." A slight smile. "Interesting timing on the marriage." "We thought so too," Caleb said pleasantly. "How did you two meet? I don't think I've heard the full story." "Through mutual contacts," Caleb said. "We took our time. Victoria doesn't do anything impulsively." He glanced at her with an expression he had not planned in advance. Something quiet, something that looked, because it briefly was, like genuine affection. "One of the things I respected most early on." Victoria's hand, which was resting on the table near his, moved almost imperceptibly closer. Daniel's eyes tracked the movement. "Well," Daniel said, and the smile didn't change, but the warmth behind it drained by a degree or two. "Lovely to meet you, Caleb. I'm sure we'll speak again." "I'm sure we will," Caleb said. Daniel circled back to Victoria with one last measured look. "He seems like a good man," he said, in a tone that made the compliment sound like a question. "He is," Victoria said, simply, without elaboration. Daniel left. Victoria exhaled. A small, controlled thing that most people at the table wouldn't have noticed. Caleb noticed. He moved his hand and placed it briefly over hers on the table, a gesture that was, on its surface, for the benefit of anyone watching. But she didn't pull her hand away, and he didn't move his. They stayed like that for a moment that was slightly longer than the arrangement required. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Caleb hadn't expected. Not comfortable, exactly, but functional in a way that occasionally surprised him with its warmth. Mornings had their structure. Coffee before the children woke up, the school morning logistics, the managed chaos of two small people who were developing, in their own wordless way, an alliance. Mia and Sophie had moved past the provisional truce of the first week into something more durable, a friendship built on the specific, intense common ground of being small people in a large world run by adults whose decisions they didn't always understand. They played together after school with the focused inventiveness of children who had independently decided that the other one was worth knowing. They argued sometimes, briefly and dramatically, over things that didn't matter, and resolved the arguments with the efficient pragmatism of children who had already calculated that they needed each other. Caleb watched it happen and felt something settle in him. The evenings were different. Most nights, after the children were asleep, Caleb and Victoria would find themselves in the same space. The kitchen, the living room, occasionally the back sitting room that looked out over the garden. And the time they spent there was the part of the arrangement neither of them had contracted for. It wasn't performance, there was no one watching. It was just the two of them, in the particular intimacy of a shared house at the end of a long day. She worked late. He'd noticed that in the first week. She would say goodnight to Sophie, come back downstairs and disappear into her office for another 2 or 3 hours. He'd started making tea around 10 o'clock, and twice he'd carried a cup to her office door without thinking about it too carefully. Just knocked and set it down. And both times she'd looked up from her screen with an expression that was briefly, entirely unguarded. "You didn't have to do that," she said the second time. "You look like you're in hour 14 of a 12-hour day," he said. She looked at the tea. "I probably am." "Is that a standard state for you?" She leaned back in her chair with the careful movement of someone whose back had been arguing with them. "It depends on the quarter. Q4 is always like this." She rubbed the back of her neck. "My father built a small contracting business from nothing. He worked constantly. I used to think I understood what that cost him." She paused, looking at the middle distance. "I understand it better now." Caleb leaned against the doorframe. "Do you think about scaling back?" She gave him a look that wasn't sharp, but was very direct. "Do you think about what you'd do if your daughter needed something you couldn't provide?" "Every day," he said. "Then you know the answer." He thought about that. "The company is for Sophie. The company is for a lot of things, but yes, among them." She picked up the tea. "It's also what I'm good at. I don't think I'm obligated to apologize for that." "I never suggested you were," he said. She looked at him over the rim of the cup. There was something in her expression, not the executive composure, not the careful presentation, but something underneath it that was more tired and more real, and more, he thought, like who she actually was. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "Someone more transactional," she said honestly. "Someone who took the money and maintained the minimum necessary performance." She set the cup down. "You're not performing." "Neither are you," he said. The silence that followed had a quality neither of them tried to name. "Good night, Victoria," he said, and pushed off the doorframe. "Good night," she said. He was halfway down the hall when she spoke again. "Caleb." He stopped. "Thank you," she said. "For the tea." For, a pause that he understood to contain more than she was going to say. "For being here." He didn't turn around. "Yeah," he said. "That's what I'm here for." He walked back to their room, a phrase he was still adjusting to, and stood at the window in the dark for a while, looking out at the garden. The winter trees were bare and still. The city hummed at a distance, its lights threading through the branches. He was not performing. That was the problem. The investigation escalated on a Wednesday. Victoria came home with a controlled tension in her posture that Caleb had learned, in the weeks since their marriage, to read like weather. She set her bag down in the entrance hall with a precision that meant she was angry, greeted Sophie and Mia with a warmth that was entirely genuine. She was never less than real with Sophie, that much had been clear from the very first day, and then waited until the children were occupied before finding Caleb in the kitchen. "Diane called," she said. "Daniel's investigator has expanded their scope. They've been speaking to people at Hale Technologies, colleagues, people who know us." Caleb set down the knife he'd been using to cut vegetables for dinner. "What kind of questions?" "The obvious ones. How long had we known each other? Whether anyone had seen us together before the marriage? Whether the relationship seemed—" She pressed her lips together briefly. "Genuine." "What did people say?" "Most people said they didn't know much, which is true and which is actually the best answer." She crossed her arms. Not a defensive gesture, Caleb had learned, but a self-containing one, the posture of a woman who was managing something she couldn't put down. "But there are people in the office who noticed the timing, who know that I called you in for a meeting and that a month later we announced a marriage. Are any of them likely to say something to Daniel's team? One of them already has." She said it flatly. "My VP of Marketing, Stephen Carver. He told the investigator that the relationship appeared to develop very quickly and that he had never seen any indication of a personal connection prior to the announcement." The kitchen was quiet. The sound of the girls playing filtered down from upstairs. Sophie's voice, high and precise, narrating something. Mia's lower murmur in response. "Is Stephen a problem?" Caleb asked. "Stephen is ambitious and occasionally resentful, and I promoted someone over him last year." She said it without heat, just precision. "It's not personal. It's useful information." "Okay." Caleb picked up the knife again. "What does Diane recommend?" "More visibility. Less isolation." She unfolded her arms, which was usually a sign that she'd moved from the feeling of a problem to the management of it. "She wants us to be seen more. Together, in contexts that read as spontaneous, not charity dinners and curated appearances, but everyday life. School drop-offs, weekends, the kind of things couples do when they're not thinking about being seen." "The things we're already doing," Caleb said. She paused. "Yes," she said, "the things we're already doing." Their eyes held for a moment. "Then we just keep doing them," he said. Something shifted in her face, not the relief of a tactical problem being solved, but something quieter and less calculated than that. "Yes," she said again, "we do." She stayed in the kitchen after that, and she helped him finish making dinner, and they stood side by side at the counters, and her chopping the tomatoes he'd been about to get to, him stirring the sauce on the stove, and the easy, unremarkable domesticity of it moved through the kitchen like a kind of warmth that neither of them acknowledged and both of them felt. The sleeping arrangement in the master bedroom had required, in the end, less negotiation than Caleb had expected. The room was genuinely large, a sitting area along one wall with a sofa and a low table, plenty of space to establish a clear geography between his side of things and hers. The first night, Caleb had slept on the sofa without comment and woken at 5:30 a.m. with a crick in his neck that he did not mention. Victoria, when she came out of the bathroom at 6 o'clock and saw him easing his neck stiffly, took one look at him and said, "This is ridiculous." "I'm fine." "You're a 6-foot man who spent the night folded onto a love seat. It's not a love seat. It seats two people comfortably, and that qualifies it." She stood at the end of the bed with her arms crossed. "The bed is a king. I sleep on the left side. I don't move, I don't snore, and I set one alarm. You can sleep on the right side of the bed like a reasonable adult." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the expression of someone who had made a perfectly logical point and was waiting for the perfectly logical agreement. "Fine," he said. "Fine," she said, and went to make coffee. It was, in the end, fine. The bed was large enough that the distance between them was considerable. There were, Caleb thought on the first real night, probably entire apartments in his former building that were smaller than the space between his side and hers. She did not move or snore. She did set one alarm at 6:15, and she silenced it within 4 seconds. She slept with a precision that extended even into unconsciousness. What she hadn't mentioned, and what he learned on the second night, was that she sometimes stayed up reading very late, sitting up against the headboard with a book and a reading lamp that was narrow and directed but present, and that she would occasionally laugh quietly to herself at something on the page, a small, involuntary sound that she probably didn't know she made. He lay in the dark on his side of the bed and listened to her occasional quiet laugh, and thought that it was one of the most unguarded sounds he had ever heard from her. He did not tell her this. He did not tell himself yet what it meant that he noticed. There was a Saturday afternoon in the third week of their shared life that Caleb would return to later, not because anything significant happened, but because of what it felt like. He was in the backyard with both girls, pushing them in turn on the old wooden swing set that came with the property. Large, slightly weathered, the kind of thing that looked like it had hosted 100 children before these two. The sky was gray and cold, but the girls were insulated in puffy coats, and the cold didn't seem to matter to them. It never did. Sophie was in the middle of explaining to him the exact and very complicated rules of a game she and Mia had invented, which involved specific spots on the lawn that had different points values and a system of penalties that seemed to shift whenever it became advantageous for Sophie to shift them. Mia was listening to this explanation with her patient, watchful look, cataloging the alterations for future reference. Caleb pushed the swing and listened and made the appropriate noises of engagement. Then he heard the back door and turned to see Victoria, in jeans and a gray sweater he hadn't seen before, coming across the lawn with a coffee for him and a look on her face that was, for once, entirely without agenda. She had been in the house working all morning, and somewhere between then and now she had changed out of her work clothes and pulled her hair back simply, and she looked young in a way she usually didn't. Young, and he thought, like herself. "I needed air," she said, handing him the coffee. "You're welcome to the swing set," he said. "There's a system of zones and penalties that I'd warn you about, but I'm still figuring it out myself." Sophie, overhearing, immediately turned around to explain the game to her mother with the same focused energy she'd applied to Caleb, and Victoria stood beside him in the cold afternoon and listened, and at some point her shoulder was against his arm, and neither of them moved away from it, and the girls were laughing at something, and the gray sky sat overhead, and the coffee was warm in his hands. He thought, this is not the deal. He thought, this is something else. He didn't have a word for it yet, but he felt it the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. Not the storm itself, but the signal that something is coming, something larger than the ordinary weather. He looked at the side of Victoria's face. She was watching Sophie with an expression so unguarded that it almost felt private. She must have felt his attention because she turned to look at him, and for a moment, just a moment, neither of them had a role to play, or a performance to maintain, or a contract to honor. They were just two people standing in a backyard on a cold afternoon, and something between them was shifting the way ground shifts before it becomes something different than it was. Then Sophie announced a new penalty rule, and the moment broke, and they both looked at the girls. And Victoria shook her head slowly, in something that was very nearly a laugh. "She negotiates exactly the way I do," she said quietly. "I know," Caleb said. "Is that frightening?" He considered. "A little," he admitted. "Yeah." This time she actually laughed. Not the quiet private one from the reading lamp at night, but something fuller, something that came out of her without being managed. He listened to it. He thought, there it is. That evening, Daniel Mercer called. Caleb was in the kitchen when Victoria's phone buzzed on the counter. She saw the name and the thing that happened to her face in that instant, a tightening, a bracing, told Caleb everything he needed to know about what 6 years of marriage to that man had cost her. She stepped into the hallway to take the call. He could hear her voice, level, controlled, and Daniel's voice on the other end, which rose and fell in the rhythms of a man who knew exactly which frequencies produced the reactions he wanted. She was gone for 8 minutes. When she came back, she set the phone on the counter very carefully and stood with both hands flat on the surface and her head bowed for a moment that felt private and enormous. Caleb stayed where he was. After a moment, she lifted her head. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were clear. He's adding to his claims, she said. He's telling the court that the marriage is proof of instability, that I made a major life decision impulsively, that it demonstrates poor judgment. She stopped. He's suggesting that someone like you, his words, couldn't possibly be a genuine partner for someone in my position, that the whole thing looks like a transaction. The words landed in the kitchen with a weight that was different from the other problems. This one was personal. Caleb felt it as such. He's trying to get to you, Caleb said. He's succeeding, she said, and the honesty of it, from this woman who rarely admitted to being gotten to, struck him more than anything else she could have said. He crossed the kitchen and stood beside her at the counter. Victoria, he said. She looked up at him. He can suggest whatever he wants, Caleb said. What he cannot do is change what's actually happening here. He held her gaze. You know what's actually happening here? Something moved behind her eyes. What is actually happening here, she asked, and the question was quiet and real, and it was not, he understood, just about the case. He looked at her for a moment. Something I didn't expect, he said. She held very still. The house settled around them, the distant sound of the girls upstairs, the tick of the kitchen clock, the winter pressing against the windows. Then Caleb's phone rang. The number on the screen was the care facility, the specific extension that always made his heart drop before he even answered. He looked at it, then at her. I have to take this, he said. She straightened. Of course. He answered and listened, and as he listened, the particular stillness of a man receiving bad news moved through him from the outside in. I'll be there in 40 minutes, he said, and hung up. Victoria was already watching him. My father, he said. His levels dropped. They're not sure. He stopped, reorganized. I have to go. She didn't ask questions or offer careful words or do any of the things that well-meaning people did when they didn't know what else to offer. She said, I'm coming with you. And she said it with the quiet authority of a woman who had made a decision. He looked at her. You don't have to. I know, she said. Mrs. Park can stay with the girls. Get your coat. He got his coat. They drove to Riverside Care in the dark, the city moving past them in its winter light, and Victoria sat beside him in the back seat and didn't say anything because she understood. He had seen this about her in the weeks of living together, that she understood when words were not the thing, and her presence beside him in the dark was enough. It was, he thought, more than enough. It was the kind of thing a person doesn't forget. Riverside Care at night had its own particular quality, a muted, watchful stillness that was different from the stillness of other places, as though the building itself was aware of what it contained and had learned to hold it gently. The corridors were lit with a low, amber warmth, and the sounds were soft. The distant beep of monitors, the quiet footfall of night staff, the occasional murmur of a television left on somewhere down the hall. It was the kind of place that made you speak in lower registers without being asked. Caleb moved through it like a man who knew every turn by heart. Because he did. 4 years of twice-weekly visits had made this building familiar to him the way childhood homes are familiar. Not comfortably, but in the bone-deep way of a place where important things had happened and were still happening. He knew the name of every nurse on the night shift. He knew which vending machine on the second floor had a stuck button for the orange juice. He knew the particular squeak of the fourth door on Gerald's corridor and had learned, without being told, to open it slowly. Victoria followed him without saying anything, matching his pace, and he was aware of her presence behind him in a way that was not uncomfortable but was new. the particular awareness of being accompanied somewhere you had only ever gone alone. Gerald Turner was sitting up in bed when they arrived, which was a relief and a reprieve from the version of events Caleb had been constructing in his head for the 40-minute drive. He looked tired. He always looked tired now, in the way of a man whose body was consuming more energy just existing than it used to. But his eyes were clear, and when Caleb came through the door, the expression on Gerald's face was the same one it had always been. That specific deep warmth of a father who is genuinely glad to see his son. "You didn't have to drive in tonight," Gerald said. "They called me," Caleb said. He crossed the room and sat in the chair beside the bed that he thought of, privately, as his chair, because it had been his chair for 4 years. He put his hand over his father's. Gerald's hand was large and rough and felt recently like something that had become lighter than it used to be. "What happened?" "My levels dipped. Dr. Okafor got cautious. You know how she is." Gerald said it with the gentle, fond exasperation of a man who appreciated the caution but wasn't going to admit it. Then his eyes moved past Caleb to the door, where Victoria was standing with her hands loosely at her sides, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, but the quiet attention of a man recalibrating. Caleb turned. He had, in the urgency of the drive, given approximately zero thought to how this introduction was going to go. "Dad," he said, "this is Victoria, my wife." He had told his father, 3 weeks earlier, that he had married someone. He had told it the way he'd planned, quickly, warmly, with the edited version of the story that contained no lies, only selected truths, that they had known each other through work, that things had moved quickly, that she had a daughter Sophie's age, and the girls had taken to each other immediately. Gerald had listened with the careful attention he gave to everything and asked only one question. "Are you happy, Caleb?" And Caleb had said, "I'm getting there, Dad," which was the most honest answer he could give, and Gerald had held his gaze for a long moment and then nodded once, which meant he was reserving judgment but keeping an open mind. Now Gerald looked at Victoria, really looked at her, the way he looked at everything, with a steady, unhurried honesty that had always been the quality Caleb admired most in him. And Victoria looked back, and she didn't perform anything. She didn't extend her CEO composure or her charity dinner warmth. She stood at the foot of that bed, and she was just herself, and whatever Gerald saw in that, he appeared to find it sufficient. "Victoria," Gerald said, "come sit where I can see you properly. These old eyes don't like working too hard." Victoria pulled the chair from the corner of the room, the chair Caleb thought of as the visitor's chair, and sat down with a natural ease that he noticed because he'd never seen her sit anywhere without purpose before. She sat beside Gerald Turner's hospital bed and looked at him and said, "He drove very fast." "He always does when he's worried," Gerald said. "Thinks I can't tell." He glanced at Caleb. "I can always tell." "I was concerned," Caleb said. "I know, I'm telling you, you can stop being concerned. Dr. Okafor is thorough to the point of being alarming, and that is a quality I respect in a physician, but it does not always mean the sky is falling." He settled back against his pillow and looked at Victoria again with that same steady regard. "You have a company," he said. It was not a question. "I do," she said. "Caleb told me. He didn't say much about it, but he mentioned it." Gerald's mouth curved slightly. "He's not one for details unless you ask." "I've noticed that," Victoria said. Caleb looked between the two of them. "I'm right here." "We know," they said, not quite in unison but close enough that it was startling, and Gerald's mouth curved further and something in Victoria's expression opened in a way that Caleb almost never saw. They stayed for 2 hours. Victoria sat with Gerald while Caleb spoke to Dr. Okafor in the hallway, a brief, clinically honest conversation that left him with the information he had been expecting and dreading in equal measure. Gerald's kidney function had declined further, the current treatment protocol was at the limit of what it could accomplish, and the next several months would require both close monitoring and, very likely, a reassessment of long-term care options that carried their own considerable costs. He stood in the corridor after the doctor left and looked at the wall for a moment. Just one moment, then he went back to the room. When he pushed the door open, Gerald and Victoria were talking quietly, and whatever they were talking about made Gerald laugh. A real laugh, the full-chested one that Caleb hadn't heard in weeks, The one that sounded like his father before the illness started taking things. Victoria was leaning slightly forward, her elbows on her knees, and her face was open and lit in the amber light in a way that struck Caleb somewhere in the middle of his chest. He stood in the doorway and neither of them noticed him for a few seconds, and those few seconds were some of the most quietly complicated of his life. Gerald saw him first. There he is. Come tell your wife to stop making me laugh. It makes me tired. You told me the story about the Thanksgiving pipe burst, Victoria said, glancing up at Caleb. I feel like laughing is the appropriate response. I have told that story at least 40 times, Caleb said, sitting back in his chair. It gets more elaborate every year. There was no embellishment, Gerald said with dignity. That Thanksgiving was genuinely catastrophic. He looked at his son with that clear, steady gaze. Did you talk to Okafor? Yes. And we'll talk about it properly. Not tonight. Caleb put his hand back over his father's. Tonight I just wanted to see you. Gerald looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned his hand over and held his son's, and the grip, though lighter than it used to be, was still deliberate, still warm, still unmistakably Gerald Turner's grip. I like her, Gerald said without looking away from Caleb. Caleb didn't say anything. Don't overthink it, Gerald said very quietly. You've always been your own worst obstacle when it comes to the things that matter. Don't do that this time. Dad, I'm not saying anything else about it. He squeezed Caleb's hand once and let go. I'm tired. Go home. They drove back through the city in a silence that was different from the one on the way there. The urgency was gone, replaced by something that sat between them in the car like a third presence. Not uncomfortable, but weightful. It was Victoria who spoke first. He's extraordinary, she said, and the word was not a performance, just a fact delivered in the tone she used for facts she meant. Yeah, Caleb said. He is. How long has he been sick? 8 months since the diagnosis, though the damage probably started before that. His body was compensating quietly for a while, and by the time the numbers flagged, it was already... He stopped. It was already a different conversation than I was ready for. She was looking out the window, the city light moving across her profile. My mother had an illness when I was in college, she said, and the quietness of it told him that this was not something she said often. Not the same, but I know the way it changes time, how everything starts to be measured differently. He looked at her. She recovered, Victoria said, but the year of not knowing... She was quiet for a moment. It changes how you hold things. You either hold them too tightly or you stop holding them at all because it's easier than the risk. Which did you do? She turned from the window and looked at him, and the honesty in her face was the unguarded kind, the after-midnight kind, the kind that happened when people were tired enough that the management slipped. Both, she said, at different times. Neither one worked. He held her gaze. I know, he said. Neither of them said anything else for the rest of the drive, but the silence had changed its character entirely. It was no longer the silence of two people with an agreement between them. It was the silence of two people who had recognized something in each other and hadn't decided yet what to do with it. The weeks after the hospital visit had a different texture. Something had shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way that either of them named or acknowledged in the daylight. But it was there, the way a season shift is there, before the temperature actually changes. Small things. The specific way he would sometimes look up from whatever he was doing and find her watching him with an expression she rearranged before he could read it fully. The way she had started sitting closer to him on the sofa in the evenings. Not touching, but within the radius of touching, which was its own kind of information. The way they had both stopped the small, bracing preparations that people make before saying something honest to someone they're not sure about. The custody investigation continued its methodical pressure on both of them. Diane Holloway called twice in 1 week with updates that were measured in the language of legal strategy but carried the weight of a situation that was more precarious than initially projected. The investigator Daniel had hired, a firm called Weiss and Associates, known for matrimonial work, had expanded its inquiry to include interviews with the school parents who saw them at drop-off, a task made simultaneously easier and more complex by the fact that Caleb had, genuinely and without strategy, become a recognizable and well-liked presence in that context. Mrs. Harmon, a woman who had appointed herself the unofficial social hub of the K through second grade morning drop-off, had taken to Caleb immediately. in the way that warm, community-minded people take to individuals who are reliably kind and present without making a performance of it. She had watched him help Sophie navigate a conflict with another child over a playground disagreement, and she had watched him kneel down to that child's level and speak to both of them with the patient seriousness he gave to everything. And she had turned to another parent and said, within earshot of the school office administrator who later repeated it to Diane, "That man is the real thing." When Diane told Victoria this, something moved in Victoria's expression that she controlled quickly, but not quickly enough. "He is," Victoria said. Diane, who was not a sentimental woman, looked at her client for a moment over her glasses, and then looked back at her notes, and said nothing. She was a lawyer, not a commentator. But what she had seen in that moment, she filed away. The first real fracture came on a Tuesday evening in the 6th week. Caleb came home from work to find the house in a state that he recognized immediately as post-conflict quiet, the specific stillness of a household where something had happened and was not yet resolved. Mrs. Park was in the kitchen with the particular focused efficiency of a woman giving the adults in the house as much privacy as possible. Sophie was in her room with the door closed. Mia was at the kitchen table doing her homework with the concentrated quiet of a child who had correctly assessed the atmosphere and decided that invisibility was the appropriate strategy. Victoria was in her office with the door closed. Caleb set down his bag, spoke quietly to Mia, learned from her brief, careful answer that Sophie had gotten into trouble at school and that Mama was very upset, and then crossed the hall and knocked on the office door. "Come in," Victoria said. She was at her desk, but she wasn't working. She was sitting with her elbows on the surface and her forehead resting against one hand, and the papers in front of her were clearly not what she'd been looking at. She looked up when Caleb entered and straightened in the way she always did, the automatic reordering of posture, but she didn't do it all the way. She let him see that she was tired. "What happened?" he said. She exhaled. "Sophie's teacher called. There was an incident at school today. Another child said something to Sophie about her family situation, the divorce, the custody case. Children talk, or rather their parents talk, and children listen." Her jaw tightened briefly. "Sophie hit the boy." Caleb processed this. "Hit him. A shove. No one was injured, but the school has a policy." She pressed her fingers to her forehead. "I had to leave a board meeting early. I spoke to the teacher. I spoke to the principal. I spoke to Sophie for an hour when we got home." She dropped her hand and looked at him, and the exhaustion in her face was the pure structural kind, the kind that comes from carrying too much for too long. "She keeps saying she doesn't care about the custody case. She says she just wants everyone to stop talking about her family." Caleb sat down in the chair across from her desk. "What did the other child say exactly?" he asked. "That Sophie's mother only got married because she was going to lose in court." Victoria's voice was very controlled. A 5-year-old quoting a parent. "Kids are very accurate reporters," Caleb said. "Yes." She looked at him. "She asked me after if it was true." A pause. "She asked me if I married you because I had to." The office was very quiet. "What did you tell her?" Caleb asked. "I told her the truth," Victoria said. "That we met and that I cared about him, and that some things don't happen in the usual order, but that doesn't make them less real." She held his gaze. "I don't know if that was the right answer." He looked at her carefully. "What made you say it that way?" She was still for a moment. The question was precise and she knew it. She had a facility for precision herself and recognized it in others. She looked at him with the after-midnight honesty that seemed to be the only kind available to either of them anymore. "Because when I was saying it," she said quietly, "it felt true." Caleb held her gaze. He thought about what his father had said in the hospital. Don't overthink it. Don't be your own worst obstacle. He thought about the backyard on that cold afternoon, her shoulder against his arm, the girls laughing. He thought about the way she'd said, "In the car, both." At different times, neither one worked. The honesty of it, the vulnerability tucked inside the precision. He stood up from the chair. "Can I talk to Sophie?" he said. Victoria blinked. "You don't have to." "I know." He moved to the door. "Can I?" She held his gaze for a moment. "Yes," she said. He knocked on Sophie's door and waited until he heard the small, subdued "come in" before entering. She was on her bed with the cat, Duchess, a large and opinionated tortoiseshell who had initially regarded Caleb with profound suspicion and had gradually, over 6 weeks, downgraded this to moderate suspicion, curled against her side. Sophie looked at him with her mother's eyes, dark, watchful, giving nothing away for free. He sat down on the edge of the bed. "I heard today was hard," he said. Sophie looked at Duchess's back and didn't say anything. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," he said. "But I wanted you to know that I'm here." A long silence. "Jackson said, 'You're not my real family,'" Sophie said. Her voice was flat, the way her mother's voice got flat when she was containing something. Caleb thought carefully. He was not going to make this smaller than it was. He was not going to give her a cheerful dismissal. She was 5 years old, and she was her mother's daughter, and she would see through that immediately, and it would teach her that he wasn't someone to bring real things to. "Jackson's wrong," he said, "but I understand why what he said hurt." Sophie looked up at him. "Why is he wrong?" "Because family isn't only about who was there first, it's about who shows up." He held her gaze. "I show up for you, Sophie, not because I have to, because I want to. But you married Mama because—" She stopped, reconstructing something. "Because it helps her." "That's how we started," he said, and the honesty of it was a risk he was taking deliberately. Not the full truth, she was 5 years old and some truths belonged to adults, but a version that was real. "But what's happening now, between your mom and me, and between you and me, that's not a deal. That's real." He paused. "You know the difference between real and pretend, right?" She gave him the look that meant she considered this slightly beneath her intelligence. "I'm not a baby." "No," he agreed. "You're definitely not." He looked at her. "Does it feel pretend to you, when I'm here?" She considered this with the seriousness she brought to important questions. Duchess shifted and stretched on the bed between them. Sophie put her hand on the cat's back. "No," she said, finally. "Then you've got your answer," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she leaned sideways and put her head against his arm, a gesture so unguarded and so trusting that something in Caleb's chest reorganized itself quietly around it. He sat with her until she fell asleep. When he came back downstairs, Victoria was in the kitchen, and she looked at him when he entered with a question on her face that she didn't voice. "She's okay," he said. "She's asleep." Victoria exhaled slowly. She had a glass of water on the counter, and she turned it in her hands without drinking from it. "What did you say to her?" "The truth," he said. "A version of it." She looked at him carefully. "Which version?" He came to stand on the other side of the island. "That what's happening now is real. That showing up matters more than the starting point." He held her gaze. She accepted it. She's practical, like you. She responds to logic. Victoria looked down at the glass. "She is like me." "She's also brave," Caleb said. She pushed back against something that felt wrong to her, even if the method was imperfect. A beat. "She gets that from you, too." Victoria looked up. Her expression was open in the way it rarely was, the after 11, after hospital, after hard day openness that bypassed the usual architecture. "I don't always feel brave," she said. "I know," he said. "That's usually what brave actually is." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Caleb." "Yeah. I don't know what this is." She said it with the plain honesty of someone who had decided that imprecision was no longer affordable. "Between us, I don't know how to classify it, and I don't do well with things I can't classify." He was still. "But I know that when you walked into that hospital room tonight," she said, "and I saw him laugh, really laugh, I thought—" She stopped, started again. "I thought that I was glad you existed, not because of the arrangement, just you. As a person, in the world." She looked at him with those clear, honest eyes. "I wanted you to know that." The kitchen clock ticked. The house breathed around them. Caleb looked at the woman across the island, at the controlled, extraordinary, quietly exhausted person who had walked into a hospital at midnight for a man she barely knew because it was the right thing to do, who had sat on the floor of her daughter's room for an hour because a little girl was hurting, who had just told him the truth because she had decided it was worth the risk. He thought about all the ways he could respond to this. He said, "I know." And then, because he was tired of being careful about the things that were already true, "I feel the same way." She held very still. "I'm not saying I know what it is either," he said. "I'm saying that somewhere in the last 6 weeks, the arrangement stopped being the whole story." He looked at her steadily. "That's honest." "Yes," she said. "It is." They stood on either side of the kitchen island, and the space between them was smaller than it had been at any point since the beginning, and both of them were aware of it, and neither of them moved to close it. Not because they didn't want to, but because they were both, underneath everything, careful people who understood that some movements couldn't be walked back. "We should sleep," Victoria said. "Tomorrow is Wednesday, and Sophie has violin, and it's Mia's library day, and you have the operations review." "I know," he said. She stopped. "I wanted to say it before it turned into something I was managing instead of feeling." He looked at her. Something settled in him, quietly, the way things settle when they've found their right position. "Thank you," he said, "for saying it." She nodded once. Then she picked up her water glass and turned toward the hall. "Victoria," he said. She paused. "Your father," he said, "tonight, with mine. You stayed. You didn't have to stay that long." She turned her head slightly, but not enough to fully face him. "No," she said. "I didn't have to." She walked down the hall. He stood in the kitchen until he heard the door of their room close softly, and then he turned off the lights and followed. He lay in the dark on his side of the enormous bed and listened to the house, and to the city beyond it, and to the controlled evenness of her breathing in the dark. And he thought about what his father had said. Don't be your own worst obstacle. He thought about the fact that he was in a situation he had entered with a contract and a price, and a specific defined set of terms, and that all of those terms had been overtaken by something that didn't fit any category he had prepared for. He thought about Mia, who had handed her most prized possession to a stranger on a front porch because she had decided the stranger was worth trusting. He thought about the way Sophie had leaned her head against his arm without asking permission, and without it being complicated at all. He thought about Gerald Turner's hand in his. He thought about a woman in a gray sweater on a cold afternoon, laughing in the backyard without meaning to. He thought, I am not pretending anymore. And the thing was, he hadn't been for a while. He had just been waiting for the moment when it was safe enough to say so. He wasn't sure that moment had arrived yet, but he was getting there. Outside, the winter city pressed against the windows, and inside the house on Aldrin Way, 4 people slept. 2 children dreaming in their respective rooms. A man and a woman lying in the same space with a shared understanding that had no contract to contain it. And the night moved slowly toward morning, the way it always did, indifferent to the weight of what was being carried beneath it, patient with the time it was taking. Some things moved at their own pace. The grief arrived on a Friday. It did not announce itself. It came in the way that the worst things come, sideways, in the middle of an ordinary moment, without the decency of preparation. Caleb was in the middle of a conference call when his phone buzzed on his desk with the care facility number. He looked at it for exactly 1 second, long enough to feel the drop in his stomach, long enough to know. And then he said, I need to step off the call, and picked up the phone. It was Dr. Okafor's voice, calm, careful, kind. The words she said were the ones he had been preparing for 8 months, and the preparation, he discovered, was worth nothing at all. He sat at his desk for a while after the call ended. He didn't move. He looked at the surface of his desk, the papers, the pen, the framed photo of Mia that lived in the corner, and he felt the particular bottomless silence of a world that had just become smaller by the most specific and irreplaceable amount. His father was gone. He sent Victoria a message. 2 words. He's gone. She responded in 60 seconds. I'm on my way to you. He wanted to tell her not to come, that he was fine, that he didn't need anything. He looked at the message for a moment. He thought about all the times he had told people he was fine when he wasn't, and what it had cost him to maintain that distance, and what it had gotten him. He typed, Okay. He put the phone down. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, and let himself, in the privacy of his office with the door closed, feel the full and unbearable weight of it. The years, the visits, the drives in the dark, the hands on the chair, the voice that had always known when he was lying, the laugh he had heard for the last time on a Tuesday evening in an amber-lit room with a woman beside him who had made his father laugh one last real time. He stayed in that feeling for exactly as long as he needed to. Then he heard a knock on his office door. He straightened. He took a breath. He said, "Come in." Victoria opened the door. She had her coat on still, as though she'd come straight from wherever she was. She looked at him. Just looked, with those clear, honest eyes. And she crossed the room and she sat in the chair beside his desk, the same chair where she had sat and listened to him talk about his father months ago. And she put her hand over his on the desk the way he had put his hand over hers at the charity dinner, and she said nothing. She said nothing at all. And Caleb Turner, who had been careful and contained and alone with the hardest things for so long that it had become the architecture of his life, felt something in that structure give way. Not collapse, not break, but open. The way a door opens when someone finally has the right key. And he lowered his head, and he let himself be accompanied. Outside, the city went about its winter business. Inside that office, something was happening that no contract had anticipated and no arrangement had prepared for. Something that had no name yet but didn't need one. It was already real. Gerald Turner was buried on a Saturday morning in the first week of December, in a cemetery on the east side of the city where the old oaks had gone bare and the winter light came down flat and white through the branches. The service was small. Gerald had been a private man who measured his world in depth rather than breadth. And the people who came were the people who had genuinely known him. 3 men from his plumbing union who had worked beside him for decades. A neighbor woman named Rosa, who had brought him soup every week for the last 2 years without being asked. Marcus, and a handful of others whose presence spoke to the particular quiet way Gerald Turner had moved through the world. Not loudly, not with performance, but with a consistency that people trusted. Caleb stood at the graveside in his dark coat with Mia beside him, her hand in his, her face solemn in the way she became solemn for things she understood were important, even when she didn't entirely understand them. She had loved Gerald in the uncomplicated, instinctive way children love people who are genuinely warm to them, and she had cried when Caleb told her, and then she had wiped her eyes with the serious efficiency of a child who had decided that crying was over and that being present was what was needed now. She was, in this as in most things, more like her father than she knew. Victoria stood on Caleb's other side. She had asked him, the morning after Gerald died, in the quiet of the kitchen before the children were awake, "What do you need from me?" She had asked it the way she asked everything, directly, without performance, and he had understood that she was genuinely asking, that there was no subtext, no strategic consideration, just the question itself. He had said, "Just be there." And she had been. Every moment of the 4 days between the death and the burial, the phone calls, the arrangements, the paperwork that arrives after a death with the cheerful indifference of bureaucracy. She had handled the things he couldn't focus on with the quiet efficiency that was her natural mode, and she had left him alone with the things only he could carry, and she had known, without being told, which was which. She had called Diane Holloway and rescheduled 3 case-related meetings without explanation. She had called the school and arranged for Mia's absences. She had coordinated with Mrs. Park so that the house ran without either of them having to think about it. She had slept beside him in the dark, and not pretended that he was sleeping when he wasn't, and once, just once, in the middle of the 3rd night when the sleeplessness had a particularly sharp edge, she had turned toward him in the dark and said very quietly, "Tell me something about him." Something small, and he had talked for an hour about Gerald Turner. The Thanksgiving pipe story. The way he said son when he was proud and Caleb when he was concerned, the smell of coffee in the mornings of his childhood, the hands on the chair arms, the laugh. And Victoria had listened to all of it in the dark without interrupting. And at some point she had moved close enough that their shoulders touched, and he had let himself lean against that small, solid warmth. And it had been enough to get him through to morning. At the graveside, she stood close enough that her arm pressed against his. He was aware of it the entire time. He was aware of her. Marcus stood on Caleb's left, and at one point leaned slightly toward him and said very quietly, under the minister's words, "She came, man." "I know," Caleb said. "She's been here every day." "I know, Marcus. I'm just noting it. I see it." Caleb glanced at his friend. "I see it." Marcus pressed his lips together and looked at the grave and said nothing else. But his expression said the thing he'd been saying in various ways for 6 weeks. Stop overthinking it. Stop treating it like a problem to manage. Just let it be what it is. It was getting harder to argue with that. After the burial, people gathered at the house. Small and warm, the kind of gathering that moves at its own pace and needs nothing managed. Marcus was there, finally meeting Victoria properly, and Caleb watched from across the room as they talked. Marcus was not a man who was easy to charm, and he was not the kind of man who performed cordiality. He was direct and loyal, and he took people at face value, and he made up his mind quickly and usually accurately. He talked to Victoria for 10 minutes by the kitchen island, while Rosa from the old neighborhood told Caleb a story about Gerald that he hadn't known, and when he glanced over, Marcus was laughing at something Victoria had said. Actually laughing, the real kind, and Victoria was watching his reaction with something that looked like genuine pleasure. When Marcus found Caleb later putting coats in the hallway, he stood close and spoke low. "She told me the story about your father laughing at the hospital," he said. "The real one, the last good one. She told it like she was trying to give it back to you, like she knew it was yours." Caleb kept his hands busy with the coats. "She paid his last 3 months of care," Marcus said. "I talked to Rosa. She mentioned you'd seemed less stressed about the bills lately, and I did the math." Caleb was still. "You didn't know," Marcus said. It was not a question. "No," Caleb said. "She didn't tell you." "No." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "She's not doing that because of the contract, Caleb." He didn't answer. "I'm going to say one thing, and then I'm going to stop, because you're a grown man and it's not my business." Marcus put a hand briefly on Caleb's shoulder. "Don't let the way this started convince you it can't be what it's become. Those are two different things." Caleb held on to the coat in his hands and looked at the wall. "Okay," he said. "Okay," Marcus said, and went back to the gathering. He found Victoria later in the kitchen, washing cups with the practical efficiency of someone who didn't know how to exist in a space without contributing to it. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment, this woman in the dark dress with her sleeves pushed up, washing cups at his father's wake in a house that was not hers, as naturally as if she had been doing it for years. "You paid his last bills," he said. She didn't startle. She turned off the water and turned to face him, drying her hands on the kitchen towel, and met his eyes directly. "Yes," she said. "You didn't tell me." "No." "Why?" She looked at him steadily. "Because you would have argued about it, and it wasn't something that needed an argument. It needed to be done." She set the towel down. "He was a good man. He deserved to not have that worry at the end." He crossed the kitchen. He stopped 2 feet from her, close enough that this was no longer a kitchen conversation, close enough that they were both very aware of the distance. "Victoria," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "Please, I can't." She stopped, looked at him with those direct, honest eyes that had been honest with him since that cold afternoon in the backyard, since the hospital corridor, since the kitchen at midnight. "I didn't do it for the arrangement. I need you to know that." "I know," he said. "I did it because—" She stopped again. "Because?" he said very quietly. She looked at him. Something moved through her face, the last of the careful architecture giving way, the final piece of the managed distance dissolving. "Because I love him," she said. "Because he was yours, and the people who are yours—" She stopped. Her voice, which was almost never anything but controlled, had acquired a quality he'd only heard from her in the darkest and most honest hours. "The people who are yours become mine. That's what I—" She looked at him. "That's what happened." The kitchen was very still. Caleb looked at her. This extraordinary, complicated, deeply private woman who had just said something she could not take back. And he crossed the remaining distance between them and put his arms around her. She stiffened for exactly half a second. The instinct of someone who had not been held in a long time. And then she let go, and her forehead came down against his shoulder, and she was not crying. She was not a crier, he had learned. But the way she held on told him everything that her composure usually contained. He held her in the kitchen of his father's wake, and felt, with complete clarity, that whatever this had started as, It had become something he was not willing to let go of. They stood there for a while. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The custody hearing was scheduled for the second week of January. The weeks leading up to it had a specific pressurized quality, the sense of a situation converging toward a point that would determine everything, and the particular difficulty of living normally inside that pressure. Diane Holloway was in near daily contact, preparing them with the thoroughness of someone who had won cases she shouldn't have won and lost cases she should have won and had learned from both. She prepared Caleb for cross-examination with a directness that he found both clarifying and slightly alarming. Daniel's attorney will try to establish a timeline, she told him, in their final prep session 4 days before the hearing. They want to show that you and Victoria had no relationship prior to the month of your marriage, and that the marriage was executed for strategic legal advantage. She looked at him over her glasses. They will ask you directly whether this marriage was entered into as a business arrangement. Caleb held her gaze. What do I say? Diane set down her pen. She had asked this question herself, obliquely, weeks ago, and the answer she'd gotten had been a measured non-answer that she'd accepted because the case required it. Now she was asking it properly, because there were 4 days left, and she needed to know what she was working with. Tell me what actually happened, she said. All of it. He told her. He told her about the office meeting, the contract, the terms, the money. He told her about moving in and the separate room and the hair crisis and the charity dinner and Daniel's grip in the hospital and the graveside in the kitchen. He told her about the cold afternoon in the backyard and the cup of tea at the office door and the things said in the dark. He told it plainly, in the order it happened. And Diane Holloway, who had heard a great many things in 22 years of family law, listened without interrupting until he was done. Then she picked up her pen. Here's what I think, she said. You can tell the court that the marriage began as an arrangement and risk the case, or you can tell the court that the marriage is real and hope they believe you, or... She paused. You can tell the truth, which is that both of those things are simultaneously accurate, and make them understand that the second one is what matters. He looked at her. Is that a strategy? It's the only strategy I have that doesn't require either of you to lie on the stand. She leveled her gaze at him. And it only works if both of you are completely honest about where you started and completely honest about where you are now. She paused. Are you? He thought about Victoria's face in the kitchen at the wake, the way she had said the people who are yours become mine, the way she had held on. Yes, he said. Then that's what we do. He called Victoria on the way home. She answered on the second ring, which was fast for her. How was the prep session? She said. I told Diane everything, he said. The contract, the arrangement, all of it. A silence. Okay, she said. Her voice was careful. She thinks honesty is the only strategy that works, he said. She wants us to go in and tell the truth, both truths. Where we started and where we are. Another silence, longer this time. Caleb, she said. If the court hears about the contract, I know what's at risk, he said. So does Diane. She thinks the truth is stronger than the alternative. He paused. But it only works if we're both willing to stand behind it completely, in front of a judge, under cross-examination. He heard her breathing. He heard the city on her end of the call, which meant she was outside, which meant she had stepped out of the office for this conversation, which told him more than anything she was about to say. I need to think, she said. I know. Give me tonight. Take it, he said. I'll be home. He was. She came in at 9:30, later than usual, with the look of someone who had been walking. She walked when she needed to think. He had learned this about her. And she came to the kitchen where he was sitting with a book he hadn't been reading, and she sat across from him, and she looked at him for a long moment. If we do this, she said, and the court decides the original contract disqualifies the marriage, I could lose the case. Yes, he said. I could lose primary custody of Sophie. Yes. She held his gaze. He didn't soften it or reframe it. She didn't need either. But if we go in there and we lie, she said, and they find out, and Daniel's team is very good at finding out, it's worse. Yes. She was quiet. Diane thinks the truth reads better than the lie, he said. And I think, he stopped, chose the words. I think that If you walk into that courtroom and you look at that judge and you tell them that you are Sophie's mother and that you have built a real home for her, that has to be the whole truth, not a managed version, the whole thing. He looked at her. Because anything less than that is something you'll feel every time you look at your daughter. Victoria looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "You're right." "I know," he said. "I hate it when you're calm about things that are terrifying." "I know that too." Something moved in her expression. Not quite a laugh, but in the neighborhood. "Okay," she said. "We tell the truth." "All of it," he said. "All of it," she agreed. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers. They stayed like that for a while, two people sitting at a kitchen table in the house they had made into a home, holding on to each other the night before the thing that could take it all apart. The morning of the hearing was cold and white, the sky the color of old paper, the city muffled under a thin January chill. Caleb stood at the kitchen window at 6:30 while the coffee brewed and watched the bare winter garden and thought about his father. He thought about what Gerald would have said. Probably something short, probably something that went to the center of things immediately, the way he had always been able to do. He thought Gerald would have said, "You know who you are, that's enough. Walk in there and be that." He thought, "All right, Dad." Mrs. Park took the girls to school. Caleb and Victoria rode together in the car, Leonard at the wheel, the city moving past the windows in the gray morning light, both of them in dark, precise clothing that said without saying it that they understood the gravity of the day. They sat closer together than they had at the beginning. This, too, was without comment or negotiation. It was just where they sat now. "How are you?" he said. "Functioning," she said. "That's something." "You?" "Same." He glanced at her. "Sophie okay this morning?" She was quiet at breakfast. She knew something was happening. Victoria looked out the window. "She asked me last night if I was going to win." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I was going to tell the truth and that I loved her, and that no matter what happened, she was going to be okay." She paused. "She told me she already knew she would be okay because she had both of us." The car was quiet for a moment. "She said both of us," Caleb said. "Yes." Victoria didn't look away from the window. She did. He held that for a moment. A 5-year-old girl's assessment of her family, delivered without complexity or qualification. Both of us. As though it had been true for years. As though it needed no negotiation. He thought, well then. The courthouse was downtown, a wide stone building with the particular self-conscious authority of civic architecture. Diane met them on the steps with 2 associates, all of them moving with the efficient pre-battle energy of a legal team that had done the preparation and now needed only the execution. She looked at both of them with the brief, assessing look she'd developed over 6 weeks of working with them. "Ready?" she said. "Yes," they said, again not quite in unison. Diane nodded once and turned toward the doors. The courtroom was smaller than Caleb had expected and less dramatic. No gallery, no high ceilings, no theatrical architecture. It was a family courtroom designed for the specific domestic business of human relationships being adjudicated by a system that tried to be fair and sometimes was. The judge was a woman in her late 50s named Honorable Patricia Wynne, with a composed, intelligent face and the unhurried manner of someone who had seen every version of every story that came through her courtroom and maintained her capacity to take each one seriously. Daniel was already there with his attorney, a man named Braddock, who had the smooth, technical confidence of someone very good at what he did. Daniel looked at Caleb when they entered, a steady, measuring look that Caleb met and held until Daniel looked away. It was a minor thing. It mattered anyway. The first portion of the hearing moved through procedural motions that Diane had prepared them for. Daniel's team laid out their case with the practiced clarity of a legal argument that had been polished into its most effective form. The marriage was timed to coincide directly with the custody filing. It had been executed within a month of the initial petition. There was no documented evidence of a prior personal relationship, and the financial disparity between the parties suggested an arrangement that was transactional rather than genuine. It was, Caleb thought, listening to it, a very good case. If he had been hearing it about 2 strangers, he might have found it persuasive. Diane's response was methodical and measured. She established Victoria's history as Sophie's primary caregiver. She presented documentation of school involvement, medical appointments, daily routines that spoke to an engaged and present parent. She called Sophie's pediatrician, who described Victoria's involvement in Sophie's care with the specific practical credibility of a medical professional. She called Mrs. Harmon from the school drop-off, who described the household she had observed with a warmth that was entirely genuine because it was based on things she had actually seen. Then she called Victoria to the stand. Victoria walked to the witness stand with the posture she always had in public, upright, contained, completely present, and she sat down and looked at Diane and then, briefly, at Caleb. He held her gaze for a moment and then nodded once, just slightly, the small signal between two people who know each other well enough that small signals carry their full weight. She answered Diane's questions about Sophie with the precision and the love of a woman who is not performing either. She spoke about Sophie's routines, her fears, the books they read together, the way she cried when she was frustrated and laughed when something surprised her, the violin that she had started because she heard a piece of music on the radio and said she wanted to make that sound. She spoke about it all with the directness that was her nature, and the love that was equally her nature. And it was neither sentimental nor polished, but it was absolutely real. And Caleb watched the judge watch Victoria and saw something in Judge Wynn's expression that was not yet a decision, but was attention. Genuine, considered attention. Then Braddock rose for cross-examination. He was good. He moved through the preliminary questions with a smoothness that was designed to create a pattern of easy agreement before the harder questions arrived. Victoria answered each one with the same level, direct composure, and Caleb watched her and thought, "She is extraordinary. She has always been extraordinary." Then Braddock said, "Miss Hale, Mrs. Turner, you married your husband approximately 1 month after my client filed his custody petition. Is that correct?" "Yes," Victoria said. "And you had no documented personal relationship with Mr. Turner prior to that month?" "No documented relationship? No." "You employed him at your company?" "Yes." "In a role 3 organizational levels below your position?" "That's correct." "And within a matter of weeks, you married him?" Braddock paused. "Ms. Hale, did you approach your husband with a financial arrangement in connection with this marriage?" The courtroom was very still. Victoria held Braddock's gaze. She did not look at Diane. She did not look at Caleb. She held the question without flinching. "Yes," she said. The stillness in the room changed quality. "Can you describe the nature of that arrangement?" "I offered him financial compensation to enter into a legal marriage with me," Victoria said. "I was advised that a stable marriage could strengthen my position in the custody proceedings. I approached someone I had observed for years to be a person of integrity and offered him a contract." "A contract," Braddock said. "This was a business arrangement." "That is how it began," Victoria said. "And how would you describe it now?" She held his gaze. "As the most important relationship in my life," she said, "other than my daughter." Braddock shifted. "Mrs. Turner, you're asking this court to believe that a marriage entered into as a financial transaction became genuine." "I'm not asking the court to believe anything," Victoria said, and her voice had its full, quiet authority now, the voice Caleb had heard in boardrooms and courtrooms and kitchen conversations at midnight. "I'm telling the court what is true. These are not the same thing." She paused. "I made a calculated decision in a moment of desperation that turned into something I didn't plan and couldn't have manufactured. The man I married has been present for my daughter every day since he walked into this house. He has been present for me in ways that She stopped. The stop was brief and real, and she continued immediately. "He buried his father 2 weeks ago, and I stood beside him because I am his wife. Not because a contract said so, because there is nowhere else I would have been." The courtroom was quiet. "I know what this looks like from the outside," Victoria said. "I know the narrative that my husband's counsel has constructed. What I can tell you is that the narrative is true and incomplete at the same time. It is true that this marriage began as a legal arrangement. It is incomplete because it stopped being only that within the first month, and by now—" She looked at Judge Wynn directly, and there was in her expression the particular devastating clarity of someone who has stopped managing their truth and is simply delivering it. "By now, Calling it an arrangement is like calling Sophie's father a custody matter. It's technically accurate and it misses the entire point. Braddock tried 2 more questions. They did not land. Victoria answered them with the same controlled, complete honesty, and each answer closed the avenue Braddock had been trying to open. When she was excused, she walked back past the gallery and she looked at Caleb, and he saw in her face the exhaustion and the relief of someone who has put down something very heavy. He held her gaze. He wanted to say about 100 different things. He said none of them. He would say them later. He would say them properly. Caleb took the stand in the early afternoon. He had been prepared by Diane with the specific thoroughness that she applied to everything, and the preparation had been valuable. But the thing that Diane could not prepare was the quality that was simply native to him. The unhurried, unperforming honesty that Gerald Turner had modeled for 32 years, and that Caleb had absorbed without being taught. Diane took him through the history with the care of someone building a structure, and he answered each question with the plain accuracy of a man who had decided that the truth was the only thing worth standing behind. Then Braddock rose. "Mr. Turner, you've testified that this marriage began as a financial agreement." "Yes." "You were paid to marry my client." "I entered into a legal contract with defined financial terms, yes." $200,000? "That's correct." "And you did this, you've testified, primarily to pay for your father's medical care?" "That was part of it, yes." "So your motivation in this marriage was financial?" "My motivation in accepting the arrangement was financial," Caleb said. "My motivation now is not." Braddock looked at him. "Mr. Turner, this court is being asked to consider the stability of a home built on a transaction." "With respect," Caleb said, "I'd like to answer the question that's actually being asked." A brief pause. "Go ahead," Braddock said. "The question is whether Sophie Mercer is safe and loved and stable in that house," Caleb said. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform conviction. He simply spoke from the place where the truth was, and the truth had enough weight on its own. "I can tell you what I've seen. I've seen her mother read to her every night. I've seen her mother leave board meetings, leave them mid-session, when Sophie's school called. I've seen Victoria Hale rearrange the most demanding schedule I have ever observed in any human being around the needs of a 5-year-old, consistently, without complaint, without negotiation." He paused. "I can also tell you what I know personally. I lost my father recently. Victoria didn't have a contractual obligation to be there. She was there for every moment of it, because that is who she is." He looked at Braddock steadily. "The arrangement that began this marriage was real, and the marriage that replaced it is equally real. I would not be sitting on this stand telling you otherwise if it weren't, because I have a daughter of my own, and she is watching me figure out what kind of man I'm going to be, and I will not lie in front of a judge so that I can be a comfortable kind of coward." The room was very still. Judge Wynn's pen had stopped moving. Braddock tried one more angle. It was, Caleb thought, the move of a man executing a good strategy in service of a bad case, and he answered it with the same level, unperforming honesty, and when it was done, Braddock sat down with the quiet efficiency of a man who knew when he had not prevailed. Diane rested her case. The wait for the ruling was 7 days. 7 days in which the house on Aldrin Way continued its life with the determined normalcy of people who had decided to keep living even inside the uncertainty. Mia and Sophie went to school. Victoria went to work. Caleb went to work. Dinners were made and eaten. The violin squeaked and occasionally resolved into something recognizable as music, and Sophie beamed when it did. The Cat Duchess had now fully transferred her allegiance to Caleb, a development that Sophie found hilarious and Mia found personally vindicating, and took to sleeping on his side of the bed, which Victoria regarded with an expression that was entirely a suppressed laugh. On the 4th night of waiting, Caleb and Victoria sat on the back porch in the cold, both in their coats, with cups of tea that had gone lukewarm, looking at the winter garden. The girls were asleep. The city hummed at its usual distance. The sky was clear for the first time in weeks, the stars unusually sharp. "Whatever the ruling is," Victoria said, "I want you to know that I—" She stopped, held the cup in both hands. "I don't have a plan for this." He looked at her. "I have a plan for everything," she said. "I've had a plan for everything since I was 23, and I started the company on a plan, and I managed Sophie's whole life on a plan, and I even had a plan for this marriage." She looked at the garden. I don't have a plan for what this has become. That's okay, he said. It doesn't feel okay. It feels, she looked for the word. Bigger than the plan, he said. She looked at him. Yes, exactly that. He shifted in his chair to face her more fully. Victoria, I'm going to say something, and I need you to just let it be said without immediately organizing it into a framework. She looked at him with an expression that was equal parts wariness and willingness. I love you, he said. That's the thing. That's what this is. I don't know when it became that, and I'm not interested in litigating the starting point. It just is. He held her gaze. And I'm not saying it because of the case or the arrangement or anything that came before. I'm saying it because we're sitting in the cold on a Tuesday night, and you told me you don't have a plan, and I think you looked more like yourself in that moment than you have in all the months I've known you, and I love who you are when you don't have a plan. She was very still. You can say it back if it's true, he said. You don't have to if it isn't. I'm not asking for a reciprocal performance. She held his gaze. It's true, she said. It's been true for... She stopped. For a while. I kept filing it under things to address later. He almost smiled. You filed it. I file things. I know you do. It was a very full file, she said. He reached out and took her hand. She let him. She turned her hand in his and held on, and the cold sat around them and the stars were sharp overhead, and neither of them tried to make it into anything other than exactly what it was. They sat on the porch until the tea was cold and the night had gone deep, and somewhere inside the house Sophie's cat knocked something over and they both startled and then looked at each other and laughed. Genuinely, both of them, the full and unmanaged kind. And it was the laugh that stayed with Caleb later, when he thought about that week. Not the courtroom, not the testimony, not the ruling, just that. The two of them laughing in the cold. The ruling came on a Thursday. Diane called at 2:17 in the afternoon. Caleb was at his desk. Victoria was in a meeting that she had asked to be interrupted for, regardless of what was happening. He answered on the first ring. Diane said 3 sentences. He sat with them for a moment. Then he called Victoria. She answered immediately, which told him she had been waiting. Shared custody, he said. Sophie lives primarily with you. Full legal decision-making authority is joint. Supervised visitation with Daniel escalating over 6 months based on Sophie's comfort. He paused. Diane says the testimony moved the judge significantly. Her words were, Judge Wynn's words were, that the court found the transparency about the marriage's origins to be evidence of credibility rather than evidence against it. On the other end of the line, he heard Victoria exhale. It was not a short exhale. It was the exhale of a woman releasing something she had been holding for a very long time. Since the filing, since the fear began, maybe longer than that. Sophie stays with me, she said. Sophie stays with you, he said. A silence that had a different quality from all the other silences between them. Come home, she said. Quietly and completely. He was already getting his coat. He thought, walking to the elevator. That word. The way she had said it. Not come to the house, or come back here, or any of the versions that would have been accurate before. Come home. He thought about a courthouse in November. A ring bought without sentiment. A contract with terms and installments and a defined endpoint. He thought about a cold afternoon in a backyard. A reading lamp at night. A cup of tea outside an office door. A hand over his in a hospital corridor. A woman's forehead against his shoulder in a kitchen, holding on. He thought about what Gerald Turner had said in the last room Caleb had ever seen him in. Don't be your own worst obstacle. The elevator opened. He walked out into the winter afternoon, and the city was loud and cold and ordinary and extraordinary all at once. And somewhere across the city a woman was sitting in a glass office with her hand over her mouth, and tears she would never admit to in front of anyone except him. And 2 little girls were in school, not yet knowing that their world had just held together, and a contract that had started all of this was about to become the least interesting part of the story. He hailed a cab. He went home. He was home in 22 minutes. The house on Aldrin Way looked the way it always did from the outside. The old stone facade, the winter bare trees lining the front path, the warm light in the downstairs windows that Mrs. Park kept on in the afternoons. But Caleb stood at the front gate for just a moment before going in, the way he sometimes stood at the edge of something he wanted to hold in full awareness before stepping into it. He had been doing this more lately, pausing at the threshold of ordinary moments, recognizing them as the kind that accumulate into a life. He went inside. Victoria was in the kitchen. She had changed out of her work clothes, charcoal blazer gone, replaced by a dark sweater, her hair down, and she was standing at the counter with both hands wrapped around a mug, and she looked up when he came through the door with an expression he had never quite seen on her face before. It was not the composed executive face or the careful strategic face or the after-midnight honest face. It was something quieter and more fundamental than any of those. It was the face of a woman who had been holding her breath for a very long time and had just, finally, been allowed to breathe. He crossed the kitchen and held her. She put her arms around him and pressed her face against his neck, and neither of them said anything for a long time. She was shaking slightly. Not from distress, he understood, but from the release of something enormous that had been held too tightly for too long. He held her through it. He put his hand at the back of her head the way he had learned she allowed herself to be held, in the particular places and at the particular angles she trusted. And he stayed still and let her have the moment completely. When she finally straightened, she kept one hand on his chest and looked at him with those clear eyes, which were bright in a way he didn't often see. She said, "Primarily with me," Victoria said. "Primarily." "Yes," he said. "That means every morning, every school day, every violin lesson, and every Monday hair crisis, and every—" She stopped. The word she had been about to say was too large to come out cleanly, so she stopped before it and held on to it. "Every bedtime story," he said. "Yes." She looked at him. "Every bedtime story." He touched her face briefly, just the back of his fingers against her cheekbone, the kind of touch that doesn't ask anything, just acknowledges. And she closed her eyes for exactly a second and then opened them. "The girls get home in 40 minutes, she said. "I know. I want to be steady when Sophie comes in. I don't want her to see me." "You're steady," he said. "You're the steadiest person I know." She looked at him. "I have spent the last 6 weeks being significantly less steady than advertised. That's because you were actually feeling things instead of filing them." Something moved across her face. "Is that your way of saying you prefer me emotionally unmanaged?" "I prefer you honest," he said, "whatever form that takes." She held his gaze for a moment with the particular quality she reserved for things she was deciding how much to let herself have. Then she stepped back, smoothed the front of her sweater with the habitual gesture that meant she was returning to functional, and picked up her mug. "Mrs. Park made soup," she said. "Good," he said. "It's cold out." "How were the roads?" "Fine." "You took a cab?" "Yes." She nodded, and this conversation settled into the ordinary register of two people in a kitchen at the end of a day, and it was so completely normal and so completely theirs that Caleb felt it in his chest like something warm and solid, not dramatic, not elevated, just real. The realest kind. He got a mug from the cabinet. They stood at the counter and waited for the girls to come home. Sophie came through the door first, as she usually did. She moved faster than Mia, with a forward momentum that was entirely her mother's. And she dropped her bag in the entrance hall with the particular abandon of a child who had reached the end of a school day and was done with it, and she appeared in the kitchen doorway and looked at her mother. Children are sensitive to the emotional weather of the adults they love the way certain animals are sensitive to barometric pressure. Instinctively, accurately, without being able to name exactly what they're reading. Sophie looked at Victoria's face for about 2 seconds, and something in her own face softened from the after-school guardedness into something more open. "Hi, Mama," she said. "Hi, baby," Victoria said. And then Sophie crossed the kitchen in 5 steps and put her arms around her mother's waist, and Victoria bent down and held her, and it was a perfectly ordinary weekday reunion between a mother and a daughter that contained inside it the resolution of 6 months of fear and legal process and sleepless nights. Sophie didn't know that. She just knew her mother's arms were around her and that something felt lighter than it had lately. That was enough. Mia came in behind, still carrying her backpack with the methodical responsibility she brought to most things. And she looked at the scene in the kitchen and then looked at Caleb with the watchful, accurate assessment she had been applying to the world since she was old enough to have an opinion about it. "Good news?" she said. He looked at his daughter. He thought about how much of this year she had absorbed and adjusted to without complaint. The move, the new house, the new school routine, the presence of strangers who had become, in the way of children, simply people she knew. He thought about how she had handed her rabbit to Sophie at the front door, and how that small, instinctive act of openness had been the thing that set the tone for all of it. "Yeah, Bug," he said. "Good news." Mia set her backpack on a chair with her customary orderliness, nodded once with the air of someone whose expectations have been met, and said, "Good. Is there snacks?" The evening that followed was one that none of them would have been able to describe in detail afterward, not because nothing happened, but because what happened was purely ordinary. Dinner around the table, Sophie demonstrating a new violin position she had learned, Mia reading at the counter, a brief theatrical crisis over whose turn it was to choose the after-dinner movie, a negotiation handled with more legal precision than the courthouse, a resolution arrived at by democratic process that somehow satisfied no one and everyone simultaneously. Caleb washed the dishes, and Victoria dried them, and Duchess wound between their feet, demanding attention, with the entitled certainty of a cat who had assessed the power structure of the household and found her position within it entirely acceptable. At some point during the movie, a story about a family of animals who built a house and then spent the remainder of the runtime defending it from various weather events, which both girls found gripping, Caleb became aware that Sophie had relocated from her designated seat on the armchair and was now occupying the space on the sofa between him and Victoria, leaning against his arm with the unceremonious confidence of someone who had decided this was where she was sitting and did not require permission. He looked down at the top of her head. He thought about the first day, the front door, the rabbit. Sophie's finger touching Henry's ear very carefully, with the tentative gentleness of a child uncertain of her welcome. She was not uncertain now. He put his arm around her, and she shifted comfortably into his side, and Victoria, who had seen the whole thing from 2 feet away, looked at him over Sophie's head with an expression that had no name but didn't need one. He held her gaze. She smiled. A real one. The full kind. The kind she almost never gave to rooms of people but had started, sometime in the last few months, giving to him without thinking about it. He smiled back. On the screen, the animal family defended their house from a particularly dramatic thunderstorm, and both girls were very invested, and the fire in the living room made the room amber and warm. And outside, the January city carried on its indifferent business, and inside the house on Aldrin Way, the family that had been assembled from the most unlikely of circumstances simply was. It didn't need anything else. 3 weeks after the ruling, Diane Holloway called to discuss the formal legal resolution of the custody arrangement, and at the end of a brisk, efficient conversation about documentation and timelines, she said something she had clearly been holding for a while. "I've been doing this for 22 years, she said. "I want you both to know that what you did in that courtroom, both of you, the choice to tell the whole truth, I've seen what happens when people don't make that choice. It is almost always worse." A pause, which was unusual for Diane. "I'm glad it worked out." "Thank you, Diane," Victoria said. She was on speaker, sitting across from Caleb in her office at home, the winter garden visible through the window behind her. "For everything. Don't thank me. Pay your invoice promptly." The line clicked off. Victoria looked at Caleb. "She's sentimental," he said. "Profoundly," Victoria agreed. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her across the desk, and thought about the conversation he had been moving toward for several weeks. Not urgently, not with anxiety, but with the careful deliberateness of someone who wanted to say the right thing at the right moment, and understood that those moments required some patience to arrive. "The contract," he said. She looked at him steadily. They were 6 months into the 1-year arrangement. The fact of this had been present in the background of everything without being discussed. A scheduled expiration that both of them had been treating with the specific silence of something too significant to casually mention. "Yes," she said, "we're 6 months in." "Yes." The original terms were 12 months. "Yes, Caleb, I'm aware of the arithmetic." "I want to renegotiate," he said. She held very still. "What terms are you proposing?" He looked at her. He had thought about how to say this and had arrived, after considerable internal debate, at the conclusion that the elaborate version would be wrong, that she would want the direct version, that the most honest thing he could offer was also the simplest. Indefinite duration, he said. No exit clause. Full renegotiation of the original terms on all counts. You're proposing a permanent arrangement, she said. I'm proposing a marriage, he said. The real kind. The kind people choose without contracts. She looked at him across the desk for a long moment. Outside the window, the winter garden sat in its bare patience, the way things look when they are waiting for the season that will bring them back. Inside the room, the fire ticked, the house breathed. The financial terms of the original contract, Victoria said, with a precision that he recognized as the way she handled things that mattered too much to be imprecise about. The $200,000, paid in full, he said. That's not part of this conversation. I know it's been paid. She held his gaze. I want to be clear that what I'm considering has nothing to do with those terms. I need you to know that I'm not accepting or declining based on anything financial. I know that, he said. I need to say it anyway. Okay, he said. Say it. I would marry you with no money involved whatsoever, she said, and the bluntness of it, the complete unvarnished clarity of it, was so entirely her that he felt it like a physical warmth. I would marry you if you were still in that apartment with the water stain on the ceiling. I want that on the record. Noted, he said, and reciprocated for what it's worth. She tilted her head. I'm not interested in the CEO, he said. I'm interested in the woman who showed up at a hospital at midnight and laughed at a story about a Thanksgiving plumbing disaster and told me she doesn't have a plan for the first time in her life. He paused. That's who I'm asking. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You realize you're proposing to someone you're already married to. The first marriage was a contract, he said. I want to propose to my wife. Something in her expression broke open, not dramatically, but in the way of something that has been held together for a long time, finally releasing cleanly, without damage, into a different shape. He had seen this happen in her once before, in the kitchen at the wake, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, because it was the most completely real. Yes, she said. Yes, what? He said, because he needed to hear it completely. Yes. I will renegotiate the terms, she said, and then because she was who she was, and because he loved exactly that about her. Indefinite duration, full renegotiation, no exit clause. She looked at him across the desk. Counterproposal. We skip the paperwork, and you come over here. He stood up. He crossed to her side of the desk. He took her face in his hands and looked at her, and she looked back with those clear, direct, extraordinary eyes. And then he kissed her. Not the courthouse cheek, not the charity dinner performance, not any version of any arrangement, just himself and just her and just this, which had been coming for 6 months and had been worth every complicated, unlikely, painful, beautiful step it had taken to arrive. She kissed him back. Her hands were in his collar, and neither of them was managing anything. When they finally pulled apart, her forehead rested against his, and they stayed there for a moment in the particular stillness of people who have arrived somewhere. We need a ring, she said. I know. A real one. Not the courthouse band. I was already planning it, he said. She pulled back enough to look at him. When? I've had a specific ring in mind for about 6 weeks, he said. I was waiting for the right moment. She stared at him. 6 weeks. You were in the middle of a custody hearing. Caleb, I didn't want the proposal mixed up with the case. I wanted it to be completely separate from all of that. He held her gaze. I wanted it to be just this, just us. She looked at him for a long moment. 6 weeks, she said again, but differently this time. Not with exasperation, but with something that was close to wonder. I'm patient, he said. I know. She looked at him. It used to confuse me. Now I think it might be my favorite thing about you. One of them, he said. One of them, she agreed. He proposed properly that evening. After dinner, after the girls were in pajamas and the evening had reached its natural settling point, he asked Mrs. Park to stay with them for a few minutes, and he brought Victoria out to the back porch. It was cold, properly cold, February cold, and they both had their coats on, and the garden sat in its white winter stillness under a sky that was clear and full. He didn't make a speech. He had considered and rejected a speech because she was not a speech person, and he was not a speech person, and the things he wanted to say had already mostly been said. In hospital corridors and kitchen conversations, and on this very porch in the dark, and the accumulation of all of those truths was already the proposal. What remained was the form. He took the ring from his coat pocket. He had chosen it 6 weeks ago from a jeweler on the north side of the city. Not the most expensive option and not the most elaborate, but the one that had looked, when he held it up to the light, like something she would actually wear. A single round stone in a clean, precise setting, nothing excessive, nothing that performed wealth or sentiment. The kind of thing she would have chosen herself, which was, he had decided, the entire point. He held it out to her. "I don't have a speech," he said. "Good," she said. "I have a fact," he said, "which is that the best decision I ever made was walking back into an office building and saying yes to a terrifying proposal from a woman I barely knew." He looked at her. "I'd like to keep making decisions with you, for as long as you'll have me." She looked at the ring, then at him. Her eyes were bright again, the way they had been in the kitchen after the ruling. She was not a crier, and she didn't cry now, but her face did the thing it did when she had stopped containing something and was just feeling it, and he thought again that it was the most beautiful she ever looked, not in spite of the lack of management, but because of it. "Yes," she said, simply, completely, without elaboration, because she was who she was. He put the ring on her finger. She looked at it for a moment, then she looked up at him. "It's perfect," she said. "I know what you like," he said. "You do," she said. "That still surprises me sometimes." "I've been paying attention," he said. "I know." She stepped forward and put her arms around him and held on, and he held her back, and the cold sat around them, and the stars were clear, and the winter city hummed its distant note, and somewhere inside the house a small cat knocked something off a shelf, and they both felt it in the way you feel a domestic sound. You have become so accustomed to that it has become part of the structure of your days. "We should go in," she said against his shoulder. "It's cold." "In a minute," he said. She didn't argue. They stood on the porch for another minute, in the cold, holding on to each other, and neither of them wanted to end it. The news traveled the way news travels in a household, not in an announcement, but in a series of small observations made by people who were paying attention. Mia noticed the ring at breakfast the next morning. She looked at Victoria's hand on her coffee cup, and then she looked at her father with her characteristic direct assessment, and she said, "Is that new?" "Yes," Victoria said. Mia looked at her father again. Something moved across her face that was too complex for 6 years old, but was entirely appropriate for a child who had inherited her father's quality of noticing what mattered. "Did you ask her?" she said to Caleb. "Yes," he said. "And she said yes?" "She did." Mia appeared to process this with the thoroughness she applied to important information. Then she nodded once. The same nod, Caleb thought, with a twist of something deep and glad in his chest, that she had given him that morning in the old apartment when he'd said, "I think I'm about to be okay." The nod of a child who had been watching and had arrived at a conclusion she found acceptable. "Good," Mia said. She went back to her cereal. Sophie required a more comprehensive explanation, which Victoria provided over the course of the morning with her characteristic precision and her characteristic honesty and the particular specific warmth she reserved entirely for her daughter. She sat on Sophie's bed while Caleb stood in the doorway, and she explained, in terms calibrated exactly to what a 5-year-old needed to understand, that Caleb had asked if he could stay in their family permanently, and that she had said yes, and that this did not change anything about Sophie's relationship with her father, and that it meant the family they had built over the last 6 months was the family they were choosing to keep. Sophie listened to all of this with the focused, evaluating attention that was so completely her inheritance from Victoria that it made Caleb's heart turn over slightly. When Victoria finished, Sophie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's staying forever?" "That's the plan," Victoria said. Sophie looked at Caleb in the doorway. He held her gaze. "Okay," she said, with the same decisive finality she had used at the front door 6 months ago, when she had decided Mia was worth knowing, as though the matter were settled and she was moving on. Then she slid off the bed and went to find Mia, because she had more important things to do than continue this conversation. Victoria looked at Caleb from the bed. He looked back at her. That went well, he said. She'll have questions later, Victoria said. Detailed ones. Possibly a follow-up meeting. I'm aware, he said. I've been in negotiations with her before. I know her style. Victoria stood up from the bed. She crossed the room to him and straightened his collar, a gesture she had started doing sometime in the last 2 months, with the unthinking ease of someone who had claimed a territory. And she looked up at him. Thank you, she said. For what? For the forever part, she said. For meaning it. He looked at her. I don't say things I don't mean. I know. She smoothed his collar. That's why it means something. The months that followed had the quality of a life that had settled into its actual shape after a long period of being held in a temporary one. Not perfect. Life had not rearranged itself into some frictionless ideal simply because the legal situation had resolved and the emotional one had declared itself. There were still difficult mornings and complicated evenings. Victoria still worked too late, and Caleb still worried too quietly, and the girls still argued over territories both physical and conceptual with the passionate investment of children for whom fairness was a moral absolute. Daniel Mercer remained a presence, not a hostile one exactly, but a complicated one, navigated with the careful attention that situations involving children and fractured histories require, and handled by both Victoria and Caleb with a consistency and a maturity that was, most days, harder than it looked. But there was a difference. The difference was that all of it, the difficult parts and the complicated parts and the ordinary parts and the beautiful parts, was theirs. Not a contract, not an arrangement, not a managed performance for the benefit of a court or an investigator or anyone's strategic advantage. Theirs, in the full and unreserved sense. The sense that means you wake up inside a life that you have chosen and you keep choosing it every morning with the clear-eyed willingness of someone who knows exactly what they have. Marcus came to dinner on a Sunday in March and sat at the table in the kitchen that had been built for gatherings, and ate the meal that Caleb had cooked and looked around at the two girls bickering companionably over the breadbasket, and Victoria arguing good-naturedly with Mia about whether the television show they had been watching was scientifically accurate. And afterward, when the girls had been put to bed and the four adults were in the living room with the fire going, he looked at Caleb and said nothing at all, just looked at him. And Caleb understood it completely because Marcus had been there for the water stain on the ceiling and the hospital corridors and the unsigned contract at the beginning, and he was here now, and the distance between those two places was the entire story. Don't say anything, Caleb said. I wasn't going to say anything, Marcus said. You were going to say I told you so. I was absolutely going to say that, Marcus agreed. But I'm showing restraint. Victoria looked at Marcus. He told you so? Several times, Marcus said. About what specifically? About the fact that the only reason he was going to be fine is because he was going to let someone in, Marcus said. He looked at Victoria. He's historically bad at that. Historically, like there are case studies. I'm right here, Caleb said. I know, Victoria said. I figured it out eventually. She figured it out faster than I did, Caleb said. She's smarter than you, Marcus said, pleasantly. She's aware, Caleb said. Victoria looked between the two of them with an expression that was entirely a suppressed laugh. I'm going to get more wine, she said, and when I come back I'd like you both to be slightly less embarrassing. She left the room. Marcus looked at Caleb. She is, Marcus said. I know, Caleb said. You good? Caleb looked at the fire. He thought about the version of himself that had sat in a kitchen 14 months ago with a list in front of him and a choice that he'd convinced himself was just practical, just financial, just a means to an end. He thought about how small that version of the story had been, how the actual story had been so much larger than anything he'd written on that list. Yeah, he said. I'm good. Marcus nodded. Your dad would have liked this, Marcus said. Quietly. The way you say things that are large and true and don't need decoration. Caleb held that for a moment. He let it sit fully, without pushing it away and without collapsing into it, just held it with the careful respect it deserved. He would have been unbearable about it, Caleb said. He would have said he knew from the first visit. Would he have been right? Caleb thought about Gerald's face in the hospital room, the real laugh, the steady, unhurried eyes. Don't be your own worst obstacle. Probably, he said. Victoria came back with the wine, and Caleb stood to take the glasses from her, and she let him. And when she sat back down, she settled close to him on the sofa, with the natural ease of a person who had stopped calculating the distance between herself and the thing she wanted, and his arm went around her the way it did now. Without decision, without ceremony, just where it went. They sat in the firelight, and the conversation moved through easy registers, and the house was warm, and the city pressed against the windows with its ordinary winter indifference, and the four adults in the living room were simply themselves, simply together, in the specific and unremarkable way of people who had chosen each other. The one-year mark arrived on a Thursday. It arrived quietly, the way real anniversaries do. Not announced by any external change, just present, a date on the calendar that Caleb noticed at his desk in the morning and sat with for a moment before the day made its usual demands. 1 year since the courthouse. 1 year since the rings bought without ceremony, and the clerk's brisk indifference, and Marcus's spectacular restraint in the face of a situation that deserved many more questions than he had asked. He came home that evening to find the house smelling like something Victoria had apparently decided to cook herself, which was, as Mrs. Park had diplomatically communicated to Caleb several weeks earlier, a decision that produced results more notable for their ambition than their execution. He stood in the kitchen doorway and surveyed the scene. Victoria at the stove with the focused intensity she brought to performance reviews and product launches. Two girls sitting at the counter watching with the expressions of witnesses to a natural phenomenon, and Duchess on the windowsill, watching with what appeared to be professional skepticism. "It smells good," he said. "Don't lie," Mia said. "Mia," he said. "It smells like the time she made the pasta," Sophie said helpfully. "The pasta was fine," Victoria said without turning around. "It was crunchy," Sophie said. "Al dente is a legitimate preparation." "It was more al dente than that," Mia said, with the grave accuracy that had been her signature since birth. Caleb came into the kitchen and stood behind Victoria and looked over her shoulder at the pan on the stove, which contained something that was, in fact, going to be fine. He put his hands on her shoulders. "It looks great," he said. "You don't have to manage me," she said. "I know it's ambitious." "You do everything ambitiously," he said. "It's one of your better qualities." She glanced at him sideways. One of them, he said. The dinner was, in the end, genuinely fine. More than fine, actually. Imperfect and warm, and eaten at the table with the four of them, and Marcus, who had materialized at 6:30 with wine, because Caleb had told him what day it was, and Marcus had said, "I'll be there at 6:30, with the decisiveness of a man who understood which moments required witnessing. After dinner, after the girls were in bed, Sophie going without negotiation because she had extracted a promise about a trip to the Natural History Museum the following weekend, which Caleb suspected had been the plan all along. After Marcus had said his goodbyes with a handshake for Caleb that turned into a brief, firm embrace and a look that carried the full weight of everything they'd been through and didn't require a word. After the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Caleb and Victoria stood on the back porch. It had become, over the year, the place where the true conversations happened. The cold conversations, the honest ones, the ones where the day's management fell away and they were simply themselves. The back porch had hosted more of the things that mattered between them than any other place in the house. The sky was clear. It was the same cold as it had been the night he proposed, the same particular February edging into March chill, but there was something different in it tonight. A slight giving, a barely perceptible suggestion that the season was considering its options. Victoria was wearing the gray sweater, the one from the cold afternoon in the backyard. The first afternoon he had understood that something was happening that had no category. She wore it sometimes in the evenings, when she had come all the way home from the day and wasn't performing anything for anyone. He liked it more than any of her expensive things. 1 year, she said. 1 year, he said. She looked at the garden. The winter trees were still bare, but there was something at the edge of the branches, the earliest, most tentative indication of what was coming, barely visible. You had to be looking for it. The original contract would have ended today, she said. I know. We'd followed it. We would be in the process of divorcing. I know, he said. I thought about that this morning. She looked at him. What did you think? He held her gaze. He thought about all the things he could say, the various true and honest and accurate things that could be said about a year that had contained more than any year of his life. and had cost more, and given more, and changed more. He thought about his father, who would have had one sentence for all of it, delivered with that unembellished Gerald Turner plainness. He said the thing that was most true. "I thought that I'm glad I said yes," he said, "to the thing that was scary. I'm glad I walked back into the building." She was quiet for a moment. "So am I," she said. And then, "I was terrified, you know. When I made you that offer, I had convinced myself it was a purely rational calculation, and the truth was, I was sitting in that office the night before and I couldn't sleep, and I was more frightened than I had been about anything since my mother was sick." She paused. "Not about the case, about asking, about needing something from someone and not being able to manage the outcome." "You could have not asked," he said. "No," she said. "I couldn't. That's what I figured out that night." She looked at him. "I could not ask because Sophie was the thing. Whatever it cost me to ask, Sophie was worth it." She paused. "And then it turned out you were worth it too." "That's romantic," he said. "I'm practical," she said. "I know. I love that about you." She turned toward him. He put his arms around her and she leaned against him, her head against his shoulder, and they looked out at the garden together, at the bare trees with their suggestion of what was coming, at the city beyond the walls, at the sky with its clear, cold stars. "What do you want?" she said. "For the next year, the next version." He thought about it. "This," he said. "I want this." She was quiet for a moment. "That's not very ambitious," she said. "I know," he said. "I've decided to be comfortable with that." He felt her laugh. The real one, the full one, the one that came out of her without being managed. And he held her through it and looked up at the stars and thought about a water stain on a ceiling in the dark, and a list on a kitchen table, and a room that smelled like old paper, and a grip on a chair arm, and a rabbit named Henry offered to a stranger at a front door, and a cup of tea outside an office, and a cold afternoon, and a hand over his in the dark, and all the accumulated moments that had moved him from that apartment to this porch, to this life. He thought, some things can only be seen from the end of them. He thought, you couldn't have planned this. That was the entire point. He held his wife in the cold on the back porch of their home, and the season that was coming continued its quiet approach. And somewhere inside the house, two little girls were sleeping, one with a rabbit tucked under her arm, one with a cat that had migrated from the windowsill to the foot of the bed. And the family that had been built from the most unlikely contract of all breathed its steady, ordinary, irreplaceable breath in the winter night. Not perfect. Not the plan. Better than either. Real. End.